A young girl came to her friend's grave and greeted him with a smile. She sat down next to the grave and noticed with a smile that there were a lot of flowers there. She looked at the grave with tears in her eyes and said that she would like to look at the flowers with him. She smiled and told her friend that she was fine, so he shouldn't worry. A moment later, she began to tell about what happened today, but suddenly, she heard someone calling her and calling her names. The young boys looked at her with a smirk on their faces, asking if he had stolen something and was eating it on the sly. He came closer to them and said that he had not stolen anything. The boys looked at him in surprise and asked why he was sitting like a rat. They pushed him away angrily and said he stank. They shouted that he was disgusting and laughed at him, but he said with tears in his eyes that he did not do it. They looked at him and said that he told them he went to the toilet, but he was sitting there. They asked if he always did this. They shouted that he smelled very badly. The boy looked at them with tears in his eyes and said that it was not so. A moment later, they froze in place as someone shouted at them and told them to gather in the hall. The boy looked at everyone intently and said that the director told them to come over. The boys were alarmed and did not know what was going on. The boy looked at his friends and said that he didn't know, but everyone was already there. He told them to hurry. Sometime later, all the boys gathered in the house. The director looked closely at everyone present and said that it was very good that they were all here. He looked at everyone closely and said that they must be quiet. The director said they should understand that such an opportunity would not arise again. The boys stood frozen in anticipation, as there were no girls in the shelter. The director looked at the gentleman and said that he had gathered all the boys. A moment later, a couple entered the room. The girl froze, looking at them, as they reminded her of angels from the books she had read. The director said with a smile that he hoped that among the boys there would be someone they would like, and the young gentleman would find himself a friend. The boys looked at them with excitement, as they did not understand what they were talking about. The girl froze as she wanted to become a friend to the master. Her friend Peter used to tell her that if she became an aristocrat's playmate, she would be able to study. She knew that she could have a chance to eat well. She knew that she could live in good conditions. The lady looked in surprise at the boy who stood timidly to the side. Her husband saw her approach the boy who was trembling with fear and called her. The lady looked at the boy with a gentle smile and said that he didn't need to be so nervous. She smiled and said that they would ask a few questions, and she patted him on the head. The lady froze in shock as she saw a cute boy looking at her with tears in his eyes. Madame looked at him intently, with a smile on her face, as she liked him very much. A moment later, the cute boy asked Madame for forgiveness. Madame smiled and said that he didn't need to apologize, and also asked how old he was. He said he was 7 years old. Madame smiled and said that it was just a wonderful age, and also asked her husband to take the boy home. The director smiled and said that it was just a wonderful choice, and they would like the boy. He was shocked because he did not expect such a thing. The lady came closer to the little boy and asked his name. He froze, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, he said that his name was Ronnie. Sometime later, Ronnie Wu was already in the estate. She thought that she was not allowed to touch anything. A moment later, the maids entered the room with a cart containing many delicious treats. The maid looked at the boy with a smile and asked if he was the one the mistress had brought. Ronnie hastily said that it was true. The maid looked at the boy closely and said that he should wash himself and come to his mistress later. Ronnie asked, puzzled if she really needed to wash herself. The maid said, surprised, that of course she did, since he was not in the best shape right now. The maid reached out to the boy, wanting to help him undress. Ronnie looked at the maid with excitement and said that she could handle it herself, since she knew how to do it on her own. She looked intently at the maids and with sweet eyes asked them to leave her alone. The maids froze in shock, as the little boy was very cute. The maid looked at him closely and said that he must promise to wash himself thoroughly. Ronnie said that she would do everything correctly. The maid smiled and handed the little boy a glass of juice and said that he could drink it. Ronnie was shocked because she saw a glass cup in which one could see the juice pouring. Trembling with excitement, she accidentally dropped the glass. The glass fell to the ground with a crash and got dirty. The young lady was shocked, as she did not want this at all. She asked for forgiveness and said that she would clean everything up right away. The maid looked at the boy with concern and said that he should not come near as he might get hurt. The maid reached out to the boy, wanting to get him away from the scene, but Ronnie P thought she was about to be beaten and took cover. The maid looked at the boy in surprise and asked what was wrong. Ronnie was taken aback and said that everything was fine. The maid was worried, but she looked at the young boy and said that they should first change his clothes. The young lady froze in shock, fearing that she would be exposed. She asked them to wait, as he would do everything himself. The maids came closer to him and said that they would now dress him in another suit. They said that they would do everything quickly. A moment later, the maids froze in place in shock. The young lady, in turn, understood that she was in big trouble, and she did not know what to do now since they found out that she was a girl. The woman looked intently at the little girl and told her to listen to her carefully. She told her daughter not to let anyone know that she was really a girl. She asked her mother in surprise why this was so. The woman smiled as she looked at her daughter and said that this must remain their secret and she must keep it until they met. The madam looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she really was a girl. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that everything was exactly like that, and she herself had hidden it. The maid said she thought she should tell them about it. She also asked what they would order her to do. The madam looked closely at the maid and told her to first change the girl's clothes and bring her to them. The lady told her husband that she could not even think of such a thing since she simply saw a cute boy. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. She was very scared because she knew that her mother had told her earlier that she should not be caught by anyone. She knew that the Duke wanted the boy very much, and they would be angry now when they found out the truth. She was very afraid that she would be sent to an orphanage again. A moment later, the maids entered the room, and the young lady was very frightened of them. The maid smiled, looking at the sweet girl, and said that they should go to the bathroom. She agreed at first, but looked at them with bewilderment. The maid looked at the girl with a smile and said that they needed to hurry. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what was happening. Sometime later, she was in a beautiful bathroom. Never before had she felt such warm water. She thought for a moment, as she had only ever washed herself in a river before. She was very much upset and puzzled because she had lied to the Duke and Duchess, but they were still kind to her. She looked intently at the maids and said that she could wash herself. The maids smiled and said that everything would be fine, and they would quickly deal with it. The maid froze, looking at all the bruises on the young lady. Ronnie pulled away from them as she felt their gazes on her. She was worried and wondered what would happen to her now. Some time later, the maid informed the masters that she had brought a girl. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they had been waiting for her. Ronnie fell to her knees like lightning and asked for forgiveness. She said that she was very sorry for what she did. The Duchess in turn was shocked as she did not expect to see something like this. She slowly approached the girl. The Duchess smiled and said that they had not called her for punishment. She asked the young lady if she could come up. A moment later, the Duke and Duchess froze in place as they saw the beautiful young lady. The Duchess looked at her husband and said that the girl was simply a cutie. A moment later, the young gentleman burst into the room and asked his parents if they had really brought him a playmate. The second son of Duke Andrea looked at his parents and said that he did not need anyone. The young lady looked closely at the boy, as she now saw the one for whom she had been brought to the estate. The young gentleman approached her with lightning speed and asked in surprise what it was. He looked at his mother intently and asked if she had bought him a doll. The young lady froze in shock. Everyone looked at the young gentleman intently, and with surprise, Ronnie became embarrassed and hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She sheepishly told the young gentleman that she was human, and Andrea, in turn, froze in shock. The Duchess looked at her son with a smile and said that they wanted to get him a friend, but he turned out to be a girl. Ronnie asked the young gentleman for forgiveness for what had happened, and Andrea looked at her sideways and said that he didn't need a friend. She looked intently at the young master and asked him very strongly not to drive her away. The young gentleman, in turn, froze in shock, blinded by the radiance of the young girl. For a moment, he thought about it as he remembered his friend bragging about his sister. Looking at the young lady, he realized that this would be his sister. A moment later, he quickly ran to his father and called him. He looked closely at his father and nervously asked him not to send the young lady away, as a girl would do just as well. The Duchess smiled and told her husband to her son that he had said before that he did not need a friend. He said that he no longer said such things. The young lady froze, not knowing what they were talking about. Andrea Kay shouted that the girl was very cute, and he liked her. The Duke looked intently at everyone present and told them to be quiet. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he had already seen the child, and that was enough. He said that it was already late and she should go to her room. Ronnie was very upset because she had unknowingly hoped, but she knew she could not be forgiven for lying. The Duchess looked at her husband and asked him to think carefully. The Duchess said that the girl would be in trouble if she went back to the orphanage. She thought that there had simply been some kind of mistake. He looked at them intently and said that this was not possible. The Duchess was surprised. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was simply impossible. The young gentleman looked at his father in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Herzen sighed heavily and said that it was simply impossible to be so nice. They froze in shock as they looked at the Duke, not expecting to hear something like that. The Duke was shocked because he thought he really needed a daughter. In fact, he couldn't believe that there were such charming children in the world. The Duke was jealous every time his friend bragged about his daughter. He simply could not believe that they took the girl. He looked at everyone present and said in all seriousness that this should not be. The Duke looked at them and said that she could stay for a while. They were very happy. The young master was very happy because he would now have a real sister. He sighed heavily and said that during this time he would decide whether to accept her into their family. The Duchess was surprised. She looked at her husband and asked if he himself did not want to let the girl go. Why did he treat her so coldly? She looked at her and she said that he told the girl to return to the room with a scary expression on her face. He said that he just wanted her to rest since she looked tired. The young master looked at his father in surprise and asked what that meant. He told his father that he really did have a very stern face, as if he was ready to eat her. One lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she was sure about that. The maid sighed heavily and told the young lady that the master had informed her that she could stay. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she would really be a friend to the young master. The maid said that it looked like she would. The young lady, in her turn, was very surprised and at the same time very happy, as it seemed to her that they had forgiven her. The maid sighed heavily. Looking at the girl, she saw an ordinary child. The maid was surprised and did not understand why they decided to leave her. Since she was a girl, Ronnie embarrassedly thanked the maid. She looked at the maid and said that she would do everything she could clean and water the flowers. She said that she would try. The maid looked at her intently and said that she would take care of it herself. The maid told the young lady that the Duke would soon come to her, and Ronnie asked in surprise and confusion if the Duke himself would really come to her. The young lady was shocked as she remembered that the Duke was very angry with her at that moment. She was shaking with fear because she was very scared. The maid sighed heavily and told the young lady that she should not upset her master, but should calm down. A moment later, the Duke entered the room with a smile on his face. He immediately asked the girl if she had rested well. The Duke froze in shock as he did not see the young lady. The maid looked intently at the master and said that if he was looking for the girl, then she was near the table. The young lady, in turn, sat quietly near the table and trembled with fear. A moment later, the Duke came up to her and called her. She started and looked at him intently. She looked at him with tears in her eyes because she knew everything would be fine, and she was told to stand still. He looked at her closely and asked if she had had a chance to rest. Ronnie said that she had. The young lady in turn shouted that she had a very good rest. She looked at the Duke intently and timidly thanked him for allowing her to stay. She asked for forgiveness in a trembling voice for not being able to say everything at once. He looked at her intently but did not answer. The Duke looked at her intently because he did not understand how she must have lived to be so afraid of people. He looked at her intently and said that he had not come to her for her apology. Looking at her, he said with a smile that he came to her to give her a new name. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled and said that it was just like that since her name was more suitable for a boy. The Duchess looked at her husband closely and asked why he didn't give the baby a new name. The Duchess smiled and said that he wanted to give his first child a name. She said that it would suit her very well. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. Stroking the young lady's head tenderly, he said with a smile that she now had a new name, and her name was Rosny Evelyn. The Duke was taken aback as he saw that the young lady's face had changed. He asked in bewilderment if she didn't like it. She looked at the Duke with a smile and said with tears in her eyes that it was a very beautiful name. She looked at the Duke intently and thanked him with a smile. The Duke glanced sideways at the maid and asked if the young lady had really been placed in this room. The maid said that this was exactly the case. The Duke looked closely at the maid and said that the young lady should be placed in Sophia's room. The maid froze in shock. The Duke looked closely at Rosny and said that the room was ready for occupancy. The maid was in shock. She was trembling with fear because she knew that this room belonged to the Duke's younger sister. As he was leaving, the Duke turned around and looking at the girl said that he almost forgot one important thing. The maid looked at the young lady with a smirk as she expected the Duke to say that he had simply made a mistake. She knew that he simply couldn't give this room to an orphan from an orphanage. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she should know that they would call her Roro. He looked at her intently and asked if she remembered the maid froze in shock. The man screamed furiously at the little defenseless boy because he was sure that he had stolen food for the guests. The boy with tears in his eyes said that he did not do it. The man shouted at him with fury because he wanted him to shut up. The man was furious and did not understand how the boy could lie to him. He raised his hand against the boy in anger. The boy shook with tears in his eyes and asked for forgiveness. He said that he was very sorry. Rosny was sleeping in a warm bed, but she was dreaming of a nightmare from the past. She was covered in sweat and was muttering in her sleep. The maid looked at the girl with disdain, since the sun had already risen long ago, and she was still lying in bed. She came closer to her and began to wake her up, the young lady asking not to touch her as she was. The maid casually shouted at the girl to wake up. The young lady became frightened and pushed the maid away. The maid was irritated and told the girl that she had frightened her. She did not understand why she had jumped up like that. The young lady in turn was trembling with fear. She was very confused, but she knew that everything was fine since it was just a dream. The maid slammed the table in anger and called out to the girl. The young lady in turn was very frightened. The maid looked at her with disdain and asked why she was still sitting. She asked the girl if she was going to wash herself. The maid told the girl that since she was awake, she had to hurry. Rosny jumped out of bed with lightning speed. She looked in surprise at the clean water that was brought to her for washing. She thought for a moment as she realized that what had happened last night was not a dream. The maid sighed heavily as she could not believe that she had to take care of such a child. She understood perfectly well that the girl was an ordinary child and no different from her. The maid was furious and looking at the girl wondered how she could behave like a princess. The maid casually threw a towel to the young lady and told her to dry herself off as the water was dripping onto the floor. The maid looked at the girl with disdain and told her to quickly change her clothes if she had finished washing. Some time later, the young lady saw the beautiful and pretty dresses. She froze in surprise. For a moment, she was taken aback and wondered if she could wear something like that. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked what she was worth. The maid casually asked the girl if she really didn't know how to dress. Rosny was taken aback and said that it wasn't so, and she knew how. She looked at the maid intently and said that she could do it herself. The maid sighed heavily, looking at the young lady. She said that it was very good since she should be able to do this, leaving. She looked at the girl with contempt. Some time later, the young lady stood still, looking at the beautiful dresses. She was puzzled and did not know how to put it on. A moment later, she heard some noise outside the door. The maid was shouting at the young master that he should not run away like that. He shouted with a smile that everything was fine and ran into the room to the young lady entering. He greeted her with a smile. The maid told the young gentleman that he should knock before entering. Andrea looked at the lady with a smile and asked if her brother had disturbed her. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile how she was feeling. The maid asked the lady if she had slept well, and Rosny in turn greeted them. The young gentleman looked at her intently and asked how she felt. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. The maid looked at the lady and said that she was talking about her wounds that had not yet been closed. The young master looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. Rosny said with a smile that nothing terrible had happened, and at the same time she called him young master. He looked at her in surprise. He was a little upset because she didn't call him brother. He said he would wait for her outside while she got dressed. Rosny looked at the maid and asked if she could keep her wounds to herself. The maid froze for a moment, looking at the young lady. A moment later, she looked at her closely and said that they would not tell anyone anything, and also suggested that she change her clothes. Sometime later, they were sitting at the table. The young lady was shocked by the variety. The Duchess looked at the lady with a smile and said that they didn't know what she liked, so she could try everything. The young lady was shocked. She thanked the Duchess and froze in embarrassment as the Duchess called her dear. The Duchess asked the lady with a smile if she had slept well, and also if she liked her clothes. She smiled and said that everything was just wonderful. Andrea smiled and pushed the plate towards her and said that she could try the dish because it was very tasty. He said with a smile that it was very tasty if you ate it all at once. The Duchess was shocked by her son's manners. The young lady in turn froze as she had never seen such food before. She slowly brought the piece of meat to her mouth because she wanted to try new dishes. Everyone looked at her intently. They couldn't take their eyes off her and really wanted to squeeze her cheeks. She looked at everyone closely and said that it was a very tasty dish. Andrea said with a proud smile that it was very good that she listened to her brother. The Duchess smiled, looking at her son. She said that he should not be too overzealous in eating. While they engaged in casual conversation, the young lady enjoyed the delicious dish. The young gentleman looked closely at the young lady's outfit. He was excited and looking at her said that she would soon get dirty. Rosny looked at him and asked what he was talking about. He said with a smile that everything was fine and that her brother would help her. At the same time, he began to roll up her sleeves. A moment later, he froze in shock as he saw her bruises. The young lady was in shock. She didn't want them to see her wounds at all. He looked at her with surprise and excitement and asked what was wrong with her hand. The young lady was riding in the carriage with the Duke. She was very excited because he had invited her to go with him. She was a little puzzled because she didn't know where they were going. The Duke looked at the girl intently, and a moment later said that she should not rub her eyes with her hands, and he handed her a handkerchief. Rosny froze in surprise and embarrassment looking at the handkerchief. She thanked the Duke. Rosny was trembling on her knees. She was crying and begging not to throw her out. The Duchess was in shock. She did not understand why the young lady was suddenly crying. She cried and said that she didn't want to show her wounds because she was vile and this place was not for her. The Duke froze in shock after hearing this. She cried and said that she was very sorry. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if he could ask her a question. Looking out the window, the Duke asked the director of the orphanage if they had thrown her out. Would he have scolded her or not? She shuddered after such a question. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if the director would hit her. She froze, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently, for he saw that she was still afraid of him. The Duke sighed heavily and asked the young lady if he looked as if he was going to hit her. She was taken aback and said that he did not. The Duke asked if she really thought they would throw her out. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her closely and said that if she was unhappy with them, he would find her another place where she would be well taken care of. The Duke looked at the lady with a tender smile and said that they would like her to live with them as long as she herself wished. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the orphanage building. The Duke calmly got out of the carriage, but the young lady stood and trembled. She called the Duke as she was very worried. The Duke did not have time to utter a word when suddenly the director of the orphanage ran up to the Duke and called him. A moment later, he bowed and trembling asked the Duke what brought him to them. The director asked the Duke with a smile if he had really come for the girl this time. The director smiled and said that the Duke could come inside and see a friend for the young lady. The director of the orphanage froze in shock when he saw the boy. He was shocked and asked the boy in confusion what he was wearing. The Duke looked closely at the director and said that it was a girl. The director was shocked as he did not expect such a thing, but a moment later he apologized for his inattention. He looked at the Duke with a puzzled expression and said that this child could easily deceive everyone, but he didn't think that she would dare to deceive him. The director said angrily that no matter how much he scolded him, he still remained so ill-mannered. The headmaster shouted that he was a very ill-mannered boy. The Duke froze, looking at the young lady. He now understood why he decided to take care of her. He knew that she was grateful for every little thing, knew how to smile brightly. He wanted to protect the child with a big heart. The Duke said with a smile that she had nothing to fear here anymore. The director looked at the girl with bewilderment and said that he would certainly punish her properly. She shouted that he was a liar. She shouted that she knew her friend Peter had done nothing wrong. The man froze in place. She looked at him intently and with tears in her eyes said that he had beaten Peter to death. The man shouted that the young lady was lying. He called on the Duke to believe him. The Duke looked at the man with fury and asked if he really had the courage to do such a thing on his land. The Duke looked at his knights and told them to take the director away. The man was very excited and did not understand where they were going to take him. The man screamed in shock and begged the Duke to believe him, and not a mere child. The young lady in turn was grateful to the Duke, since he was the only person who believed her. Andrea ran up to Rosny and asked excitedly if she was okay. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said that they had been very worried about her. A moment later, the Duchess hugged the children tightly. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she was a very good and sweet child and she deserved to be loved. The young lady was shocked. She couldn't believe that such good people believed her and cared about her. She felt very good, and it seemed to her that she would cry again. The young gentleman looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. Rosny looked at him with a smile and said that she really was fine. She felt very calm in her soul, and she thought that now everything would be fine. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said that she had a very beautiful hair color. The young lady was surprised, as no one had ever said anything like that to her before, but she thanked the Duchess nonetheless. The Duchess thought for a moment, as her hair would soon be longer than her shoulders. She knew the lady would look simply amazing. She looked at the young lady and said that first, they needed to apply the balm to her body. She said that if it was applied regularly, the wounds would heal. The Duchess looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could ask her something. Rosny agreed. The Duchess asked the young lady excitedly how it was that she had pretended to be a boy at the orphanage. She said that her mother had told her not to tell anyone that she was a girl. She sighed heavily and said that even the headmaster thought she was a boy. The Duchess thought that maybe her mother wanted to spare her daughter trouble. The Duchess looked at the girl with a smile and said that now she did not need to hide it. They loved her for who she was and were glad she was part of their family. The young lady looked at the Duchess with a smile and thanked her for everything. Herseg said with a smile that he wanted to provide her with documents confirming her identity, and he gave his own name as a guarantor. He looked at her intently and said that Alexander Hayes Marcus was his name. She froze in embarrassment because it was beautiful. A moment later, the Duke showed the young lady where her full name was written on the documents. He said that he also remained the guardian of Rosny Evelyn Clave until she came of age. The Duke looked at her closely and said that no one had that name now, but it was his family name. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that this would help her in the future, for example, in her studies. She looked hard at the Duke and said that in that case she would try her best. Rosny told the Duke that she would certainly study writing diligently. She looked at him intently and said that she would learn whatever the Duke said. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really do everything he told her to do. The young lady said that she would. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that in that case they could play. The young lady froze in place. The Duke said with a smile that his son had been watching her all this time because he wanted to play. Andrea shouted to his father to let the lady go quickly. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that it was the job of children to run around and have fun. He shouted and said that she must hurry and get to work. The young lady in turn shouted that she would do everything immediately. The Duke looked after them intently as they ran away in a hurry. He sighed heavily as he looked at the documents, as he knew that they couldn't talk, because there was no suitable situation. Andrea fell to the ground with a thud and said with a smile that it was a lot of fun to play with the young lady. He smiled and said that they needed to take a little rest and asked the lady to sit next to him. He asked me if she didn't want to call him Brother Rosny. Puzzledly said that she couldn't be so impolite to him. He looked at her with a smile and said that she would call him that when she could. He smiled and said that he would be looking forward to this day. The young lady agreed with a smile. He froze looking at her because he did not understand why she was hesitating. A moment later, he came closer to her and said that this gesture meant a promise. Rosny Z froze in place in surprise, as she had never seen anything like this before. She gazed intently at the lake, which sparkled with its beauty. She looked into the distance and told the young master that the sky was simply beautiful. A moment later, she looked at the young master, as she did not hear an answer, but noticed that he was sleeping soundly. She was surprised, because she didn't expect him to fall asleep so quickly. She wanted to look around a little while the young master was sleeping. The young lady was walking slowly in the surrounding area. She looked at the lake in surprise, as it was very large. She knew that if she could climb a tree, she would be able to get a better view of the lake since she had been climbing trees all the time at the shelter. The young lady slowly climbed the tree, but a moment later, she froze in place. She was puzzled as it was very slippery. She could not rise higher and thought that she should come down to the ground. A moment later, she froze in place because she saw someone. Taken aback, she became frightened and let go of the tree she was falling very quickly. She screamed and froze in place, but the young man managed to catch her. Opening her eyes, she froze in shock as she saw a young man holding her in his arms. Rosny looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not know who he was, but she thanked him nonetheless. A moment later, she started as she heard the young master looking for her. She looked intently at the young man and asked him to let her go. Andrea looked intently at the young lady and said with a smile that he had found her. He looked at his brother in surprise and asked why he was here. The young lady froze in shock. She looked at the young man intently, as she did not expect that he was the elder gentleman. The Duchess looked at her son and said with a smile that he was very naughty because he came home and did not come to them. The young lady sat quietly and listened to their conversation. The young gentleman looked intently at everyone present and said that he was going to pick up his brother. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he was curious about the child the father was writing about. The young lady in turn stood there, embarrassed, not knowing what to answer. She was puzzled because he suddenly looked at her and spoke. The Duchess looked at them intently and said with a smile that now was the time to introduce themselves. The Duchess introduced their first son Julius with a smile. She looked closely at the young gentleman, for he looked very much like the Duke. Andrea P. looked at the young lady and asked why she wasn't eating. Andrea smiled and told his brother that he could call her Roro. He looked at his father in surprise and said that it was his nickname, and the Duke in turn choked on his tea. He looked at his son in surprise and asked if it was bad. Julius said that it was exactly like that. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would call her by the same name. The young lady was shocked because she wanted to introduce herself beautifully. Andrea smiled and presented the young lady with a beautiful, delicious cake. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should try it soon, and he fed her. The lady was shocked because the cake was very tasty. She looked at everyone present in surprise, as she did not understand why they were all looking at her. She froze in shock and fear as she saw the young master's cold gaze. She looked intently at Andrea and asked him to help her. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she wanted to play after eating. They sat and chatted casually for a while. The servant approached the Duke and called him. The servant said that guests had arrived. They were surprised as they were not expecting anyone. The servant said that the Marquis's wife and daughter had come to see them. The Madame looked at the maid and asked where her brother was. The maid looked intently at the Marchioness and said that the Duke and Duchess were drinking tea in the garden. The Marquise asked the maid in surprise if they really had guests. The young lady looked at the maid intently and asked if they had anyone visiting. The Marquise looked intently at her brother and called him. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had come to them. She asked him with a smile what kind of questions he was asking, as she always came at this time of year. She said with a smile that she wanted to see her wonderful nephews. The Marchioness looked at the Duchess with a smile and asked how she was doing. The Duchess greeted the Marchioness. She looked intently at the Marquise and said that if she had warned of her arrival, they would have prepared a place for her in advance. A moment later, the young lady greeted her uncle and asked with a smile how he was doing. Rosny froze in shock as she saw that the girl looked like a princess from a fairy tale. The young master sat quietly sipping tea. He poured juice into a glass and told her that she must not forget to drink. The lady was delighted, as she thought that he wanted to offer her a drink too. But a moment later, she froze in shock as she saw the young gentleman servicing the girl. The Marquise and her daughter looked at everyone present. She was shocked that her brother took an orphan from an orphanage. The maid said that the girl was clever enough to pretend to be a boy. She sighed heavily and said that her brother had too soft a heart and was easily deceived. The maid said, looking at the marquise, that taking advantage of the Duke's trust, the girl even received a noble name. The marquise looked at the maid in surprise and confusion and asked what she was talking about. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that the Duke had given away the room that they usually used. The marquise was shocked. The marquise looked at the young girl with fury as she had no idea who she was dealing with. She wanted to deal with her as quickly as possible. Andrea sighed and said that it was very difficult with his aunt and sister. She looked at him in surprise and asked why. He said that his aunt is like a teacher, telling him to sit quietly and eat only healthy food. And Lydia follows his brother everywhere and treats him like a servant. He hoped that they wouldn't come this time. The young lady was shocked because she didn't expect that beautiful girl to behave like that. He hugged the young lady with a smile and said that it didn't matter because he had her and they would play together. He took her hand and pulled it, saying that there were many interesting things in his room and that they could play there. But a moment later, she cried out in pain and he was taken aback. He looked at her in surprise and asked excitedly if she had hurt her hand again. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and said that, fortunately, she was not badly hurt. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he understood correctly that she was trying to climb the tree. She said that everything was correct. We are a moment, he thought, as her wounds were not like recent ones. The doctor looked at her closely and asked if her bruises were going away quickly. She smiled and said that everything was fine and they were healing quickly. He looked closely at the young lady as he had heard that her injuries were very serious. The doctor looked at the young lady in surprise as he saw that the wounds were now almost invisible. He heard that the Duchess applied healing ointments. He looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked if she had really used him. The Duchess sighed and said that they could not heal all her serious wounds. She smiled and said that she wished she would get better soon. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he was very glad that she was feeling better. He said with a smile as he left that she could call him if she felt unwell. Rosny P. thanked the doctor. The doctor knew that the young lady was as nice and kind as the Duchess. The young lady in turn thought for a moment, as the gentleman had said the doctor turned out to be wonderful. She also wanted to heal other people because she wanted to help them in similar situations. She froze in surprise, as for the first time, she thought that she wanted to do something. Before she only thought about how to reduce her pain. Rosny was very happy and pleased because she knew that it was all thanks to the Duke and Duchess. She was excited because she did not know how to thank them. A moment later, she heard the voice of the young master. The young gentleman looked into the young lady's room with a smile and asked how she was feeling. He wanted to know if she had finished her treatment. She smiled and said that she was fine. He smiled and said that in that case they could go to his room. But a moment later, he was startled as his sister suddenly came up to him and greeted him. He was surprised and puzzled, but looked at the young lady. The lady said that she had frightened him. She looked at him with a smile, asked why he was so surprised, as it upset her very much. Lydia looked at the young lady with a gaze and greeted her with a smile. Roro Wu smiled and greeted her back. Lydia smiled as she looked at the young lady. She said that she couldn't greet her properly earlier. She said with a smile that she was Yus and Andy's cousin. Her name was Lydia. Lydia smiled and said that she used to be sad that there were no girls her age here. So now she is very happy to meet you. Roro smiled excitedly and thanked her. She said that she is also very happy. Lydia looked at the young lady intently and asked why they didn't have a girls only. The young lady looked at her in surprise, as she didn't understand what she was talking about. Lydia said with a smile that they could go and have tea, just the two of them. Roro looked at Lydia intently, because unlike her, she was a real lady. Looking at her, she realized that she herself did not fit into this place. She looked at Lydia intently and said with a smile that she would be happy to go with her and have tea, as she was very kind. Lydia, in turn, looked at the young lady with a grin. Lydia told the young lady that they could go to her room since everything was ready there. Roro said with a smile that it was very wonderful. She followed her, but the young master wanted to stop her. For a moment, he froze in shock as he expected her to go with him. He wondered if he should tell his brother about this. Lydia smiled at the young lady and said that they had already arrived in her room. Roro was surprised as the room was very large. Lydia looked closely at the young lady and said that the maid would soon bring tea and desserts. Sometime later, the maid brought them some snacks. Lydia said with a smile that they looked very appetizing. Lydia looked at the young lady and said that she should try them. And she also said that this tea was made from leaves grown at their home. The young lady thanked them for their concern. She noticed that the tea was very hot, and she needed to be careful with it. She froze for a moment as she saw the servant's intense and angry gaze. She was perplexed and did not understand why she was looking at her like that. Lydia looked closely at the maid and told her that it was not nice to look at a guest like that. The maid sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness for her inattention. The maid was puzzled and did not understand how she could hold the cup with both hands and make such loud sounds being the daughter of the Duke's family. The young lady in turn froze, not knowing what to answer. The maid looked sideways at the young lady and said that she didn't even know basic manners. The maid looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she was humiliating Lady Lydia by sharing a meal with her. Lydia was shocked. She shouted at the maid to stop saying such things. Lydia looked at the young lady intently and said that ignorance was not equal to a crime. Roro froze in place with tears in her eyes. Lydia looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if it was her fault. A moment later, a young gentleman burst into the room and asked what was going on. Everyone froze in shock. The young gentleman looked at the young ladies intently. Lydia was agitated, as she did not understand why her brother came to them. Andrea looked at his brother intently and asked where he was going. The young master looked at his brother in surprise and said that he was going to training. Andrea looked at his brother intently and said with admiration that he really wanted to see his sword skills. He really wanted to go with him. Julius looked at his brother in surprise and asked what happened to Roro. Since they were together, Andrea froze for a moment. He looked closely at his brother and, sighing heavily, said that the young lady had been taken away by Lydia Julius Zede, froze, as he had not expected to hear such a thing. Andrea said that they were going to play together, but Lydia came and took her away. He said that it was no wonder that the young lady liked the lady, since she was just a cutie. The young gentleman thought for a moment about what his brother had said. He knew that the young lady was very small and fair, and he thought that she was really cute. He said with a smile that since they were girls of the same age, they would become friends faster than he and Roro. Andrea was shocked. He said that Roro would not do such a thing. He looked at his brother intently and said that such a bad person as Lydia could not become Roro's friend. Julius Z froze in place and shuddered. The young man looked at his brother intently and asked, puzzled, why he had stopped. The maid looked at the young master with concern, as she had accidentally spilled the water. The maid apologized to the master and said that she was very sorry. He looked at her closely and said that she must have been very scared. He said that this should not have been done and that she had nothing to apologize for. The maid looked at the young master with a puzzled expression and asked for forgiveness, as she really didn't mean to do that. Trembling, she said that she simply lacked experience. The young lady in turn looked at the maid intently. The young gentleman was slowly returning to his room when suddenly he froze as he heard some noise. He heard his sister screaming and asking the maid how she dared to behave like that, with her brother Lydia furiously asking the maid if she really thought of becoming his friend. The young master burst into the room and froze in shock as he saw the maid on the ground, trembling with fear, and Lydia next to her. He looked closely at his sister and asked what she was doing. Lydia looked at the maid with fury and said that she would not forgive her for what she had done to her brother. Julius B turned to the maid and said that she should get up. The maid burst into tears. Lydia looked intently at her brother and called him. The young master looked at his sister intently and asked what right she had to punish their maid. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. He glanced sideways at his sister and angrily told her not to dare even touch the Duke's men. The young lady in turn froze in shock, on the spot, not knowing what to say. He froze for a moment because he knew that things were completely different now, and he knew that Lydia could not have acted like this. But he still turned around and ran towards them. Andrea was surprised. He ran after his brother and asked him if they weren't going to the training ground. Julius in turn understood perfectly well that he had better check everything. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked excitedly why he had come. Julius looked at his sister with fury and asked how she dared to mock a child who had been adopted into the ducal family. He came closer to the maid and asked angrily if the marquise's maid had always been so impudent. The maid froze in shock and began to mumble something incoherently. Lydia ran up to her brother and with a smile asked him for forgiveness for not training the maid well. Lydia looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she was very sorry, and as her apology. She didn't have time to finish speaking before the young master pushed her away. Julius looked askance at his sister and said in a cold voice that the child was free to do whatever he wanted on the estate. Lydia froze and could not utter a word. He walked slowly up to the young lady and looking at everyone present said that in future he would advise them to treat her with respect. He was very angry and said that the Duke himself would take care of punishing this servant. Lydia was shaking with anger. She agreed with her brother. Lydia looked at the young lady closely and with a smile asked for forgiveness for not taking proper care of her. Roro was taken aback and said that it wasn't true and it was her own fault. Lydia looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that next time they should have a good time. Some time later, they were walking slowly down the corridor. The young master looked at the young lady intently as he saw that she was very thoughtful. Roro was puzzled as she wanted to learn manners. He looked at her intently and said that she shouldn't be so afraid. The young lady looked at him in surprise. After asking for forgiveness, she asked what he was talking about. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was their house and they were just guests in it. She froze looking at the first young gentleman as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the young gentleman for a moment, for he really did look like a duke. She in turn understood everything perfectly well, but knew that this could not continue. She understood perfectly well that if she did something wrong, it would cause inconvenience to everyone. Julius looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she was excited about something. Roro in turn knew that even if she couldn't thank them now, at least, she would become someone they wouldn't be ashamed of. Lydia looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to take etiquette lessons with her. Roro replied and said that she couldn't do that, and it wasn't quite like that. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could just stand by her side during class. Lydia in turn saw that the young lady was acting as she planned. Lydia said that if the young lady wanted to act like a servant, she could stand as long as she wanted. Lydia asked the young lady why they didn't study together. She said that it was much easier to study if you had someone to follow as an example than to study alone. The young lady in turn was immensely grateful to Lydia for the chance she had given her. A moment later, Lydia was informed that it was time for class. A moment later, a young man entered the room. Roro froze, looking at the young man, as she thought it was Peter. She ran closer to the boy, as she was sure that he was her friend. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, he said that he was not Peter's. Roro sighed heavily and looked at him with tears in her eyes. She said that she was very sorry. Lydia looked at the young lady intently, and with a smirk said that she didn't need to apologize like that, since he was her whipping boy. The young lady looked at Lydia in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lydia sighed heavily and said that for the children of nobles, they always have at least one child who will be beaten in their place in class. Roro looked at Lydia with bewilderment, as she did not understand why children were beaten. Lydia looked at the young lady with a cold gaze and asked if she really thought it was okay to use physical punishment on noble children. Lydia looked at the young lady intently and said that since she was going to class with her, she would lend her the boy. Roro was shocked and looked at the boy intently. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that she would repeat once again that she should not reveal her knees. Roro hastily apologized for her clumsy actions. The lady looked at the girl and told her to repeat it again. The madam looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she had again gotten out of her pose. The madam looked at the girl and said that the beta tried to repeat after Lady Lydia. Lydia slowly showed her skills. Lydia looked at Madame intently and told her not to scold the young lady too much, as she unfortunately had not had the opportunity to learn etiquette before. Roro in turn was very puzzled as her legs hurt very badly, and it was difficult for her to stand. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to take etiquette lessons. The Duchess was a little alarmed and said young lady that she was still too young for this Roro. In turn looked closely at the Duchess and asked her again about it. Roro Lena told the Duchess that she would not cause her any inconvenience. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise and said worriedly that she did not mean that at all. She said that Roro was still small and needed to play more. Roro looked at the Duchess intently and said that she would definitely cope completely. The Duchess in turn looked fixedly at the young lady, for this was the first thing she had asked of her since she had come to live with them. The Duchess sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, she agreed with her, but said that if she found it difficult, she could stop practicing etiquette. The young lady in turn was very happy. She smiled and said that she would certainly try her best. She was puzzled as she was hardly allowed to do such a thing. She understood perfectly well that for this reason, she simply could not give up now. Madame looked intently at the young lady and sighing heavily said that without this, it would not work. The young lady in turn looked at Madame with alarm. The Madame told the young lady to hold out her hands to her. The boy looked at the Madame with excitement and asked her to wait. Lydia ran up to the young lady and excitedly told her to think again. Lydia was worried that the young lady might get hurt. She asked her if she wanted to take her servant Leon too. Roro looked askance at the boy. A moment later, looking at the boy, she said that she would take the punishment herself. The boy froze in shock as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and said that it was entirely her fault, and she could not make someone else answer for her mistakes. Lydia looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she really meant to see the other nobles, including her, with these words. The young lady in turn was taken aback and said that she did not mean that. Lydia sighed heavily and leaving said that it was her right. Madame came closer to the young lady and said that she would treat her with complete respect. A few days later, the young gentleman was very happy that he and his little sister would go into the forest. He ran to her as fast as he could and sang a cheerful song since they had not played together for a very long time. They were both very busy as he had fencing lessons with his brother, and she had etiquette lessons. A moment later, he walked into the young lady's room with a smile and called her over. He smiled and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, but a moment later he saw her and froze in place in shock, and in doing so he dropped the basket on the ground. She looked at him in surprise, but the young gentleman was already running towards her, with tears in his eyes. He froze in shock as he saw that the young lady was extremely exhausted and tired. The young gentleman paced nervously around the room. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was fine and he should not worry. He was puzzled and could not understand how he should not worry since she looked like a skeleton. She looked at him timidly and said that she still had a lot to learn. He looked at the young lady with surprise and indignation and asked if that was the reason she had been turned into their walking skeleton. He wanted to know who had allowed this to happen, as he could not forgive it. He froze looking at the young lady as he saw that her face had changed abruptly. A moment later, she started crying very hard. He was in shock and didn't know what to do. He quickly ran up to her and asked why she was crying. With tears in her eyes, the young lady said that she was not crying at all. He was furious and did not understand who dared to make his little sister cry. She said that she was fine and nothing had happened. Julius V came into the room and picked up the cookies from the ground in surprise. He looked at the young people and said that if they scattered food on the floor, their mother would scold them very much. He looked at them intently and asked if they didn't know about it. The young lady was shocked when she saw the young master. She ran away with lightning speed because she didn't want him to see her. She was in shock and didn't want to show herself to him like that. She didn't want him to see her and ran away without looking back. But the young gentleman quickly caught her, and the young lady floated in the air. The brothers looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. Julius looked intently at his brother and said that he would listen to them first. Julius looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was sure she didn't want to tell them everything. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her closely and said that she could tell him everything, and he would scold everyone. The young lady timidly said that nothing like that had happened. She just wasn't feeling well. Andrea looked at her closely and asked where it hurt. He said that they could go to the doctor quickly. Julius looked closely at her hands. A moment later, he looked at his brother and told him to pick up the basket from the shelves and bring more snacks. Andrea looked at his brother in surprise and asked if it was important now, as he could see that the young lady was worried. The young master looked at his brother with anger and asked if he had forgotten how he had scattered food all over the room. Julius S. told his brother to do as he said, and a moment later, he pushed his brother out of the room. Julius looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not need to hide it. The young lady in turn said embarrassedly that she did not understand at all what he was talking about. A moment later, he sat down on the ground and extended his hand to her. The young lady froze in embarrassment, as she did not expect this. She looked at him in surprise and said that he should not kneel, but a moment later, she made a long sound. As he touched her hand, she timidly said that she was all right. He looked at her intently and said that she was not okay at all. He sighed heavily and said that they needed to treat her wounds now. The young lady in turn stared at the young master, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her closely, wondering if she was really ill. Julius looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he was finished, and she would soon feel better. Julius looked at her intently and said that everything would be taken care of so that she could rest. Roro, in turn, was very embarrassed by the young master's behavior. The young lady looked at him and timidly said that she wanted to go with him, since she did not want to be alone at all. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. The young master was surprised, because he knew that there should be a maid with her who was taking care of her. But a moment later, he looked around the room, which was empty. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was alone. He saw that she was in the room, but the fireplace was not lit. He was shocked and thought that this simply could not be. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in bewilderment, as she saw that he was worried. He stood behind the door and suddenly heard the conversation of the maids. One of the maids asked her friend if she was sure that she had hidden the item well. The maid sighed heavily and said that she had hidden everything very well. The maid sighed heavily. She was irritated and did not understand why they should take care of the girl. She said with a grin that now the girl would understand her place. The young master froze in shock on the spot. He wondered if the conversation he heard just now was the young lady. For a while, he stood there indignant, because he knew that such a thing simply could not happen. The young lady in turn looked at him in bewilderment. Julius was puzzled, because he knew that his parents were careful with the little lady and were afraid to burden her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that now he understood everything. The Duchess looked at the maid in surprise and asked if it was really Julius who had sent this letter. The maid looked at the Duchess intently and said that the young master had said that it was very important, and he had also asked her to come to the young lady's room, as she would understand everything when she saw it. The Marchioness looked intently at the Duchess, and sighing heavily, asked what had happened. The Duchess looked at the Marchioness and said that nothing serious had happened. Her son simply wanted to discuss something about the young lady. The Marchioness looked at the Duchess with a grin and asked if it was true. The Duchess, looking at the Marchioness, smiled and asked for forgiveness, as she had to leave for a short while. The Marchioness, smiling, said that everything was fine, as she had to pick up Lydia so that they could go together. The Marchioness looked at the Duchess with a smile and asked her if she was sure she wanted to punish their maid, as she did not think it right to throw her out for just one wrong word. The Duchess looked at the Marchioness intently and said that he was her husband, and she was his sister, and Rosny was the child the Duke had brought into the family. She said that to speak to her in such a careless tone was to show disrespect to the whole family. The Marchioness smiled hysterically and said that everything was correct. She looked at the Duchess intently, for she was furious and did not understand how she could boldly compare the child with her, a direct descendant of the family. She was furious and wanted it all to end quickly. She looked at the departing Duchess with a smirk and knew that her plan would soon come true. She never liked that the Marquise behaved like the mistress of their family. The Duchess looked at the Marquise intently and said that from now on she would very much like the Marquise to inform about her visits in advance. The Marquise said with a smile that she did not think it was necessary because she was born and raised in this estate. The Marchioness in turn wondered how long the Duchess would cover the little girl. Walking down the corridor, the Duchess froze for a moment as she heard some noise. Lydia was furious. She looked at the maids and asked who took it. The Marquise ran up to her daughter in surprise and asked what had happened. The young lady in turn screamed and said that her necklace was missing. The Marquise looked at her daughter in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lydia looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and said that the necklace her father had given her was missing. She was very upset because the necklace was very dear to her. The Marquise looked closely at her daughter and told her not to worry, as they would find him soon. The Marquise said with fury that no one dared to offend the Duke's own blood and the Marquise's daughter. The Marchioness looked at her daughter intently and told her to think carefully about whether she had looked everywhere in the room. The Duchess looked at them intently, without saying a word. A moment later, the young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and said that Rodney probably knew about him. The Marchioness looked at her daughter in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lydia said with a smile that she and the young lady had attended etiquette lessons. She looked at them intently and said with a smile that they could go to the young lady together right now. Lydia looked at her mother closely and asked if it was true that Rosny had taken over their room, and the Marchioness was alarmed. Lydia was furious and shouted that this question could not be asked since they did not even know the Rosny family tree. The Marchioness looked closely at her daughter and told her to be quiet. The Marquise thought for a moment she was worried and wondered if they treated her this way because she did not inherit the Marquez family's abilities. Divine power originated from the very first emperor, who descended from heaven. The power appeared in the members of the imperial family, as well as in some families, where the blood of the first emperor flowed, and many generations later, glimmers of power remained only in the families of the emperor and the Duke of Marquez. The Marquise was puzzled, for she knew that this power was not just authority, and legitimacy comparable only to that of the emperor. She wondered if it was beginning to show in the young master. She understood perfectly well that if he married Lydia, the whole family would be in her hands. Some time later, they were all sitting in the room and talking. The young lady in turn was puzzled and did not understand why they were all gathered in her room. The Marquise smiled and said that they had not had tea together for a long time. She looked closely at the young gentleman and asked how he was doing at the academy. She smiled, looking at the young gentleman, and said that they heard he again finished the semester with excellent grades. Julius continued to slowly drink tea. He sighed heavily and said that he was just lucky. The Marquise looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that he was the very picture of modesty. She looked at him with a smile and said that they would like to know more about the academy. Julius in turn looked intently at the young lady who was trembling. The Marquise in turn looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she liked the tea. Since it was their family's signature recipe, Rosny Opashila looked at the Marquise in surprise. A moment later, she said that it was indeed very tasty. Lydia looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was now holding the cup perfectly. The young lady was taken aback, but still thanked her. Roro was puzzled and didn't know what to do. She was very worried because she saw that they were staring at her. A moment later, she heard a crash. The maid looked at the young lady intently and asked for forgiveness. Lydia looked at the maid with a smile and said that everything was fine and she did not need to worry. Lydia sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry that the carpet was dirty. The maid sat down to wipe away the tea, but a moment later she froze as something sparkled. She looked at her mistress in surprise and called her. The maid looked at her mistress intently, and a moment later she handed her the necklace and said that it was hers. The young lady and the Marchioness froze in shock. Lydia looked at her maid in surprise and asked excitedly how it had ended up there. Lydia glanced sideways at the young lady and said that it was her necklace. Roro Z froze in place. In shock, she did not understand what was happening. She looked at everyone present in surprise as she saw that they were all looking at her. She was puzzled. Lydia rushed towards the young lady with tears in her eyes and shouted that she was a thief, and also asked if she really wanted to hide the necklace until they left Roro. O was shocked and began to tremble with fear. She shouted that it was not so, and that she had never even thought of such a thing. The Marquise looked at the young lady with fury and said that this was unprecedented impudence on her part. The Marchioness looked at the Duchess intently and shouted angrily at her to look for, in spite of the favor shown to her by their family, she had acted in such a manner. Looking at the Duchess, she shouted that the young lady had committed a vile act by stealing someone else's property. But meanwhile, the Duchess sat quietly and sipped her tea, not paying attention to anything. The young lady was taken aback. She screamed that it was not true, and she did nothing, since it was the first time she had seen such a necklace. The Marchioness looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she really had the audacity to ask someone after what she had done. The Marquise sighed heavily and looked at the young lady with fury. She said, "This is what a person without a conscience looks like." The young lady in turn trembled with fear, since she had done nothing like that. She glanced sideways at the first young gentleman, for she saw that he was very angry, and she knew that it was all because of her. She was very excited and shaking with fear. She knew that she had to prove to everyone that she did not steal the necklace. She looked intently at the Marquise, for her very glance made her tremble, and she was afraid even to utter a word. Some time later, the Duchess put the cup down on the table with a bang and called the Marquise. The Duchess told the Marquise to stop doing this. The Marquise looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The Duchess looked at the Marquise with fury and said that she would not forgive them even for touching the young lady. She looked at them with cold fury and asked if they really were accusing her without reason. The Marchioness was shocked. She looked intently at the Duchess and asked in surprise what she was talking about. The Marchioness in shock asked the Duchess if she really suspected her. Pelsera looked at everyone present intently, as she didn't even know that everything would happen like this. She looked at the Marquise with fury and wondered how long she intended to lie so brazenly. The young gentleman looked at the Marquise intently and asked her to calm down. He was furious, and looking at the Marquise asked how after this she could call herself an adult. The Marquise was shocked, as she did not want to quarrel with the young man at all. The young master hugged the young lady with a smile and reassured her. He smiled and said that she should not worry, since they would definitely protect her. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked intently at the young gentleman. She simply could not take her gaze off him. At the same time, Lydia was shaking with rage. She did not understand why her brother was so kind to the girl. She was furious because he believed her words. The young master looked at his sister with anger and told her to stop and watch her language better. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock as she saw her brother's cold gaze. The Marquise looked at the young gentleman with fury and asked whether, despite the evidence, he really believed only the words of some child. The Marchioness shouted angrily at the Duke that this was a direct insult to the Marchioness's family. The Marquise was furious and shouted that she would not leave it like that. A moment later, the Duke entered the room with his son. He threw the door open with fury. He looked at his sister intently and said that she was the one who crossed the line first. The Marquise looked at her brother in surprise, as she did not expect him to treat her like that. She looked at him intently and asked him to listen to her. The Duke in turn did not even listen to her and walked past her. The Marquise was shocked, as she did not expect to see such behavior from her brother. The young lady froze in place in surprise as she saw Duke P come straight up to her. He looked intently at her small hands, which were injured. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he, unfortunately, knew nothing, and he also asked her forgiveness. The Duke looked at his sister with fury and said that the one who was behind everything that happened was her. The Marquise recoiled and took a few steps back as her brother's aura frightened her greatly. She sighed heavily and said that it was not she who hit her, as it was the tutor. The Duke said with fury that the one who hired the tutor and allowed physical violence was she. The Duke walked slowly up to his sister and looked at her with fury. He said that, as the child's legal guardian, he had every right to punish her for this. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she would be better off looking for a new godfather. Lydia and the Marquise were shocked, as they did not expect such a thing from the Duke. Lydia was furious. She looked at the girl intently because she understood that she had taken away her brother, as well as her uncle. The Duchess slowly approached the young lady and said that she must be very scared. Rora was taken aback and said that she was fine. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and told her to wait a little, as he would soon be finished. The Marchioness, in turn, looked intently at everyone present. She was very angry. The Marquise looked at her brother with fury and said that he must understand that renouncing the Marquise family would not bode well for him. She asked us with fury whether he was really ready to even abandon her and Lydia because of that girl. The Duke stroked the young lady's head tenderly and said with a smile that this was not a child with whom they could do as they pleased. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was all because she would be their daughter. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot as he said that she would be their daughter. The Marquise in turn looked at her brother with fury, while Lydia shouted at her uncle that he could not act in such a way. Lydia was furious. She screamed at her uncle that he could not drive her away and give preference to an orphan. The Marquise looked closely at her daughter and told her to calm down. Lydia looked at her mother in surprise. The Marquise angrily left the room in which the happy family was, while Lydia glanced sideways at the young lady, giving her a cold look. Andrea rushed towards Roro and, hugging her, asked if she was okay. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in surprise, as she did not expect this. He looked at her intently and said that he told his father everything. Andrea said that he told his father that they dared to scold her and mock her. The Duke looked at his son and called him. The Duchess with the snail looked at the young lady and asked, "How about a short walk with Andrea?" Roro looked at the Duchess in surprise. The Duchess smiled and said that they could take a walk, for at this time of year very beautiful flowers bloom, and they could admire them. The young lady in turn agreed with a smile. The Duke sighed heavily and said angrily that children should not witness such scenes. He looked at his servant closely and told him to call all the servants of the house at once. The Duke was furious, and he wanted to find out everything that had happened. The young master looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really giving away the necklace. He said that she could just give it to the maid. Roro looked at the young master intently and timidly said that the egg thing looked very expensive and important. He sighed heavily and said that such kindness might come back to haunt her. They hadn't even had time to go outside when Lydia suddenly ran up to them and angrily asked the young lady how she dared to take her place. Roro Z froze in place. She didn't know what to say. Lydia looked at the young lady with fury and, swinging her head to hit her, asked who she was anyway. Rosny Z froze as she expected to be hit. But a moment later, the young gentleman stepped between them and received the blow instead of the young lady. Lydia froze in shock. She looked timidly at the young gentleman and asked why he stood between them. He looked at Lydia intently and said that it was all because Roro was his little sister. Roro O walked up and looked at the gentleman intently. She was afraid for him, as his cheek was very red. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if she had seen how cool he was. Roro looked at the young master with excitement and said that they needed to quickly treat his wound. Meanwhile, Lydia was burning with rage. Lydia glared at the young lady and asked her if she didn't realize that her very existence was an inconvenience to their family. Andrea glared at Lydia and told her to watch her language. He looked at Lydia with fury and said that he would not allow her to insult Roro. Rosny stood between them and told the young master to calm down. Lydia, in turn, looked at the young lady in surprise as she saw that she was heading straight towards hers. Roro slowly put the medallion into Lydia's hand. She looked at Lydia intently and thanked her. Lydia froze in place in surprise. Lydia looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she just said. Roro Wu smiled and said that, thanks to them, she was able to learn a lot. Rosny said with a smile that, taking her words into account, she would try to never cause inconvenience to people again. Lydia froze in shock, but at the same time she was very angry. Rosny else looked at Lydia and said with a smile that she didn't have to worry about it anymore. Some time later, all the servants gathered in the hall. They were very excited as the meeting was organized suddenly. They looked at each other closely and whispered to each other because they did not know what was going on. They wondered if someone had done something wrong. Madame in turn was puzzled, as she had only just packed her things, following the sudden departure of her mistress and my lady. She was puzzled and wondered why she was now standing in the hall. She was excited because she felt like she was a person who was expecting punishment. The maid was puzzled as she learned that the Duke and Duchess had found out about everything. She heard the servants talking as they were wondering what was going on. The maid looked at her friend intently and asked angrily what she was doing. The maid sighed heavily and casually said that there was enough firewood in the room. The girl heard the other maids whispering. They were making fun of the young lady because they thought she was crying and making a lot of noise. They were shocked and did not understand how an insignificant orphan dared to pretend to be a princess. The girl was puzzled because she saw everything but could not stop. She thought she just needed to treat the young lady even better. She sighed heavily, as expected. She had made a big mistake. Lydia threw a pillow at the maid in anger and shouted that she had ordered her to be moved immediately. She was furious after her conversation with the Duke, and in her rage she smashed everything that came to her hands. Leon P. ran closer to the young lady as he wanted to stop her. He looked at her sharply and said that she was in the Duke's house and she could not damage his property. The young lady looked at the boy with fury. A moment later, she turned around in fury and struck him in the face. She looked at him with disdain and said that he was an Arab brought to them from another country. She did not understand how he dared to open his mouth. Leon O. dropped his gaze to the floor and stood silently, listening to what she was saying. Lydia looked at the boy with fury and contempt and told him to get out of her sight immediately. She screamed that here she was, determining their fate, even to life and death. The Duke looked at everyone present with fury and asked if and they knew the reason why he had called everyone together. The Duke slowly approached Madame. He looked at her with fury. Madame, in turn, froze looking at the floor. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked, "Can she tell him what she did wrong?" The lady, trembling with fear, timidly said that she did not know the reason why he had called her here. The Duke looked at Madame with fury and said that she was reckless, using corporal punishment on a child who would soon become part of their family. All the maids froze in shock. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked if she admitted her guilt. Madame was taken aback. She was in shock and did not expect to hear such a thing. Madame looked at the Duke intently and said that she was only following Duchess Sophia's orders and doing what she wanted. The Duke looked at Madame with cold fury and asked how she dared to call her Duchess. He looked at Madame intently and said that the Marquise had not held that title for a long time. He looked at her puzzled and asked if she really intended to mock the Marquez family. Now Madame froze in shock. Trembling with fear, she said that it was not so. The Duke looked at Madame intently and said that he had stripped his sister of the status that had been given to her by the previous Duke. He said that he had also given the order to expel her from the estate. The maids were shocked because they did not expect the Duke to send her away. They said it was simply impossible. The Duke looked at everyone present, and for a moment he seemed to think that the expulsion was too harsh for the mayor. But he also understood that if he had not reacted to this situation so harshly, the child could again face the same trials. He looked at everyone present and said that now he would call them one by one and ask about their misdeeds. Everyone present froze in place from shock, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. Looking at everyone, the Duke said that since he knew about everything, he simply would not tolerate lies from them. Andrea looked at the young lady closely and said that she sincerely wanted to return the necklace to her, and she treated her like this. He sighed heavily and said that this was expected. He looked at the young lady intently and took the necklace. Sighing heavily, he said that they could just forget about it, and they didn't have to worry about such things anymore. With lightning speed, he threw the necklace away. The young lady was shocked, as she didn't expect such a thing. She looked at him intently and said that his wound needed to be treated. The young master looked away and said thoughtfully that he thought he would immediately feel better if she called him brother. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it wouldn't be more effective to just apply it. The young master looked away and said that rationality wasn't always useful. A moment later, the young lady froze in place and looked away in surprise as she saw many servants leaving the estate. Looking closely, she saw a young man who was also leaving the estate. She looked at the boy in surprise as she did not understand why he did not follow Lydia. She froze in surprise as she saw the maid Roro screamed and called out to Anne. Roro ran up to the maid with lightning speed and asked with a smile where she was going. Anne froze in place for a moment, not knowing what to answer. The butler slowly approached the young lady and asked if the lady knew this maid Roro, looked at the butler with a smile on her face, and said that it was exactly like that, and she had known her since she arrived at the estate. Roro looked at the maid in surprise, as she saw that she was holding a suitcase in her hand. She looked at her with a smile and said that the maid was very kind to her. The young master excitedly ran up to the young lady and asked what she was doing there. The butler looked at the young lady intently and said that, by order of the Duke and Duchess, all the people were dismissed. The young lady in turn froze in place after she heard the butler's words. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently and asked why she froze. She mumbled something inaudible, and he looked at her in surprise. Andrea asked excitedly if she could speak louder. A moment later, the young lady screamed with tears in her eyes for everyone to hear, as she did not want them to be fired at all. Everyone froze in shock, as they did not expect such a thing from the young lady. The Duchess froze in shock. She did not understand how this was possible. She was shaking when she read all the information. She did not understand how they could so cruelly mock the poor child. She looked at her husband closely and said that they should have kept a closer eye on the baby. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was also to blame for not keeping an eye on the situation. The young gentleman looked at his father closely and asked if he was sure of these punishments. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was sure, as they would serve as an example to everyone. He looked at his son intently and said that they would send everyone away without giving them a letter of recommendation. Julius sighed heavily but did not answer. The Duke said that this punishment was tantamount to depriving him of the chance to find another similar job. The young master looked at his father intently and said angrily that this punishment was too merciful. Julius was very angry at those who did this to such an innocent girl. The Duchess walked slowly, opened the door for her son, and called him in. She looked at him intently and said that such a punishment would be enough. She said that their girl was capable of crying over the most trivial things without that. She looked at her son closely and said that excessive punishment, on the contrary, could only make the situation worse. She sighed heavily and, looking at her son, said that it would be better to hide the fact of the punishment from her altogether. A moment later, the butler burst into the room and called his master. He was very alarmed. He looked at everyone present and said that it was very urgent. They froze looking at the butler, as they did not understand why he was so excited. The young lady tearfully asked the maid not to leave. Anne looked at the young lady intently and asked her to calm down. A moment later, the Duke and Duchess arrived on the scene. They were surprised and did not understand what was happening. The young lady rushed to the Duchess in a hurry and asked her not to fire the maid. Roro looked at the Duchess intently and said that the maid had been very kind to her all this time, and if it weren't for her, everything would have been very bad. The Duchess looked at the girl in surprise and agreed with her. She said with a smile that she needed to wipe away her tears. Julius looked askance at his brother. Andrea looked excitedly at his brother and said that he had not done anything at all. The Duchess looked at the maid intently and said that she was very sorry and that there seemed to be a misunderstanding. The maid sighed heavily and looked down at the ground. She said that everything was wrong. The Duchess looked at her intently and said that she should have told her earlier that it was not her fault at all. The Duchess was a little surprised and did not understand why the maid continued to remain silent. The maid, with tears in her eyes, said that it was all because she was actually to blame, since she saw that the other maids were torturing the child, but she was unable to stop them. The Duchess looked intently at the maid, but said nothing. A moment later, the young lady approached the maid and said that she was not guilty of anything. Roro knew that the maid was the only one who treated her warmly. She looked closely at the maid, and with a smile on her face said that she would very much like her to stay with them. Anne was a little surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, because everything she did for her was so insignificant. She was surprised and did not understand why the young lady was so grateful to her. The Duchess looked intently at the maid. A moment later, the Duchess said with a smile on her face that the young lady seemed to have become very attached to her. The Duchess said with a smile that she had a good idea. The Duchess looked at the maid intently and asked with a smile, "How about Togo becoming her personal maid?" Anne looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duchess smiled as she looked at the maid and said that if she became a personal maid or a young lady, she would be able to take care of her directly, being always there. Everyone present began to whisper, as they understood that this meant that the maid would be promoted to become a senior maid. The Duchess smiled at the maid and said that their young lady liked her very much. She looked closely at the maid and asked with a smile on her face what she thought about this. Pelsera looked at the maid and asked if she could stay with the young lady. The maid looked intently at the young mistress. She did not know what to answer. A moment later, she looked at the Duchess and, sighing heavily, said that she did not deserve this place, But she quickly changed her face and said with a smile that if they still gave her a chance, she would serve them with all her heart. Roro looked at the maid with a smile and said that she was very happy. The maid smiled and said that she was also very happy about this opportunity. The young lady in turn glanced sideways at everyone present and saw a little boy standing in the distance. She slowly approached the Duchess and asked her to wait a minute. The Duchess looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. Roro Yu pointed to the young man and asked the Duchess if the boy could also stay at the estate. Roro looked at the Duchess intently and said that if the boy returned back, they would start beating and torturing him again. She asked the Duchess not to throw him out. The Duchess was very surprised and shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She said that initially she just wanted to return him to the Marcus family, but if she wanted, she could keep him. A moment later, the maid fell to the ground and asked the Duchess to give them a chance to stay in the estate. They shouted that they would serve them even more diligently and sincerely. Then the servants reached out to Rosny and begged her. They begged the Duchess. They knew she had a kind heart. They asked her for one more chance. Julius put the sword to the servant's throat and told her to stand where she was. He looked angrily at the maids present and said that they should be glad that they had been treated so gently. He looked at everyone present and told them to leave immediately. As they left, they screamed and begged for another chance, hoping for leniency. The young gentleman slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. The maid looked at the young people intently and embarrassedly. Andrea froze in shock. He looked after them in surprise and asked if everyone had really forgotten about him. Julius looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he was very glad that the problem was already solved. She looked at him in surprise and asked where they were going. He sighed heavily and said that he had to return to the academy tomorrow. The young lady was shocked, as she didn't expect him to leave so quickly. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, the holidays would be over soon. He looked at her intently and said that he needed to leave for the academy tomorrow so that he could arrive early. The young lady in turn was shocked by such a statement, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady in turn froze with tears in her eyes, as she did not expect him to leave so suddenly. The young gentleman looked at her intently and told her to give him her hand. She looked at him in surprise, but still obeyed. A moment later, the young gentleman gave her a lollipop. She looked at him with embarrassment, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile on his face, did she really not want him to leave? He looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if he should stay any longer. The young lady was very embarrassed. She did not know what to answer and timidly mumbled something. A moment later, she shouted that she didn't dare ask him for anything at all. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face. He gently stroked her head and said that he would come again, so they would see each other again soon. Andrea looked at his brother with fury and said that he would kill him. The young lady in turn froze in place, as she did not understand why this was happening. Andrea looked at his brother intently and said with fury that the young lady was his sister. He asked his brother not to take her away from him. Julius Z froze in place from shock, and since he did not expect to hear such a thing, Julius looked at his brother intently and said with a smile that he was actually offended. And he also asked his brother if it was he who had been following him around and saying that he loved him more than anyone in the world. Andrea looked at his brother closely and said that he was still little then, and this was all before they had a sister. Julius looked at them with a smirk and said that in that case he would leave them. He smiled and said that they could have fun and that he had to go. At the same time, he called them kids. Andrea was shocked because he knew that they were not kids at all. The young lady looked at the young master timidly and said that he had said earlier that he would be returning to the academy tomorrow. He looked at them intently and said that he was going to fencing training. Now it would last until dinner. The young lady thought for a moment. Andrea shouted to his brother that he really wanted to watch his training. Roro, in turn, also wanted to go with them. She was puzzled and did not know what to do in this situation. Golovnin. Later she cried out in embarrassment and told the young gentleman that she would help and give him the necessary things. She asked to take her with him. The young master looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Roro timidly said that she could bring water or a towel. She said that she would be next to him to help. He looked at her intently and said that this would not happen. Andrea was shocked as he saw his little sister's face droop. Julius looked at the young lady intently and said that her help was not needed. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her with a smile and said that she could just watch him practice instead. The young lady was shocked, but at the same time very happy. She smiled and agreed with him, and also thanked him. He looked at her intently and said that only the one called his younger sister could go with him. The young lady froze in shock as she did not understand what he was talking about. Andrea came closer to her and said that his brother meant that she addressed him incorrectly. Roro, standing in place, began to timidly mumble something to the tray. Julius Ukodia sighed heavily and said that he could not do anything since he would have to take only Andrea with him. The young lady in turn was in shock. She froze in place, not knowing what to do. A moment later, she screamed for all to hear and called her brother. She looked at them intently and asked Julius Fifth to take her with him, but she called him brother. Andrea froze in place in shock as she was very sweet. Julius looked at the young lady intently, and a moment later said with a smile that she could come with them. A moment later, they walked to the training ground together. The young lady was very happy about this. Rosny stared at the young gentleman who was practicing fencing. She stared at him as if fascinated, but she was a little puzzled, for she knew nothing about fencing. But she knew that even she could see that his skills were simply amazing. Andrea came up behind her and called her. The young lady froze in shock as she was scared. Andrea looked at the young lady intently and said that no matter how cool their brother was, she should not fall in love with him. He said that he was her first brother. Roro looked at him in surprise for a moment and then agreed. He looked at her intently and told her to pay attention to him because he could do the same. Rosny looked at the young gentleman with a smile and said that he was just a great guy. Andrea looked at her embarrassedly and with a smug smile said that he had told her the same thing. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked if he and his brother really wanted to become knights. He looked at her in surprise and hesitating said that perhaps that was the case. Julius slowly approached them and thought for a moment. He said that this was necessary in order to become the heir. Andrea, in turn, thought for a moment, but did not answer. Julius looked at the young lady intently and said that in order to become the head of the family, one must obtain the recognition of the sacred object. The young lady was surprised, looked at him, and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it was a family symbol that had been passed down from generation to generation for many centuries, and the sacred object of the Marcus family was the spear of Ares. He sighed heavily and thinking said that in order to master this spear, it is necessary to first study the art of fencing, since this object has the shape of a sword. He said that the spear has this shape until it begins to resonate with the divine power, and the spear form is not applicable. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that of course it requires regular and diligent training. He gently stroked the young lady's head and said with a smile that he would return as soon as he finished training. He asked her to wait for him. Andrea looked closely after his brother and, sighing heavily, said that perhaps soon his brother would be able to resonate with the sacred object. The young lady in turn looked after him in surprise. Andrea sighed heavily and, looking intently at his sword, said that his brother already knew how to handle divine power. He said that everyone is looking forward to him succeeding in this. He said with a smile that his brother is a real genius. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise as she saw that he was a little upset. A moment later, they heard some noise in the distance. A few minutes later, a knight came up to them and said with a smile that he noticed that they were not wasting their time. He smiled and said that now he saw what it meant to stand on the path to greatness. Sir Cosvin looked at everyone present and saw the young lady Roro jumped up and greeted the knight. The young lady in turn greeted Sir Cosvin according to all the rules of etiquette and said her name with a smile. Sir Cosvin Z was frozen in shock on the spot as he was blinded by the beauty and sweetness of the young lady. He walked towards the young lady in a puzzled manner and said that his name is Cosvin and he is responsible for the safety and peace of the Marcus family. He looked at the young master intently and timidly said, "It seems he has a new playmate." Andrea looked away and said that he already has Roro. The young lady in turn looked to the side in surprise and saw a familiar face. Leon slowly walked up to them and greeted them. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that his name was Leon. Andrea looked at the young man with puzzlement and said that he didn't need him. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked why he was saying such things. Andrea sighed heavily and said that he only needed his sister, and the extra ones would only get in the way. Young master's playmate. The young lady in turn looked at him in surprise. Leon said that he would be the young master's playmate. Andrea looked at him intently and asked if he really needed to learn how to handle the ball first. The young man sighed heavily and said that was exactly the case. Andrea smiled and with lightning speed hugged the young man and said with a smile that he should have started with this. Andrea smiled and said that it was very good since he would teach him fencing. Leon sighed heavily but did not answer. The young lady looked at them with a smile, since it seemed to her that the young master liked Leon. Julius looked at his brother intently and asked who he was going to teach. Andreas looked at his brother with fury and asked what business it was of his. Looking at his brother Andrea, he said that he could handle it even better than him. He shouted that, although he had personal skills, he was no teacher. Julius P. even more quickly approached his brother and hit him on the head. He looked at his brother intently and asked what he had just said. Andrea was in shock. He shouted to his brother that he was in pain. He looked at his brother intently and asked indignantly if he would take responsibility if he got a bump. Ulysse looked at his brother and asked why he should take responsibility. Besides, he hit him lightly. The young lady stared at them for a while. She was surprised because she didn't expect them to act like this. Leon looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if they could step away for a while. Roro looked at him in surprise but still agreed. Sir Cosvin watched the young people closely. He was shocked and could not believe that they were all so cute. The next day, they all said goodbye as the young master was leaving for the academy. The young lady looked at her brother with tears in her eyes. He slowly approached her and, wiping the tears from his face, said with a smile that he would be back soon. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she should not cry, but should play while he was gone. The young lady sighed heavily, but still agreed. The young master looked at her with a gentle smile. Some time later, the young lady was in her room crying quietly. She knew she shouldn't cry, because the young master had told her not to cry. She was puzzled, as she was very sad. A moment later, a maid knocked on her door and asked if she could come in. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not expect the maid to come in. A moment later, she looked at her closely and said that she could come in. She saw a maid who was bringing her refreshments. Anne looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she should eat the treat and her mood would immediately improve. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the young lady was eating the treat with a smile. She smiled at the maid and said that the food was very tasty. Enwu smiled at the young lady and said that she was very glad that she liked everything. The maid smiled as she looked at the young lady and said that the young master said that she liked chocolate very much. Roro was surprised, as she didn't understand how he knew. Anne looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if her mood had improved at all. Roro looked at the maid with a glare and asked her forgiveness and asked if she could ask something. The maid smiled and told the young lady that she could speak to her informally. Roro was surprised, but still agreed with her. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she could ask her anything. Roro looked at the maid in surprise and asked why she was so kind to her, and Z froze for a moment as she didn't expect to hear something like that. The maid thought for a moment, and a moment later said with a smile that it was because the young miss was very nice. NP understood the young lady. Anne looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she really liked her character, and when she first saw her, she reminded her of her little sister. Roro was surprised, because she didn't expect that she had a sister. Anne looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she was as kind as the young lady. Anne sighed heavily as she looked at the young lady. She said that, unfortunately, stories don't always end well. Sometimes heaven takes good children early. Roro was very excited and surprised, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. Anne sighed heavily and with tears in her eyes said that because her sister was too kind and good, She passed away very early in life. Roro looked at her maid with tears in her eyes, as she did not expect this. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was fine, and the young lady did not need to make such a face at all. Roro looked at the maid intently and said that she also had a very good friend who left this world early. Rosny looked at the maid intently and said that for this reason, she would definitely become a doctor and help children. The maid looked at the young lady with surprise and embarrassment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, looking at the young lady, she said that in that case she should study hard from now on. The young lady smiled and said that she would definitely try her best. Enyi looked askance at the young lady and said that she should go outside soon. The young lady looked at the maid in confusion. The maid smiled and said that games were a great learning experience for children like her. She thought for a moment, as she had heard something similar somewhere before. At the same time, the Duke was closely watching the young woman from the window. The Duke saw a young lady who was having fun walking in the street. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that before the adoption process could be carried out, it was necessary to know the fate of the young lady's biological parents. The Duchess looked at her husband intently and said that he was right. She looked closely at her husband and asked if he had questioned that man about her biological parents. The Duke sighed heavily and said that there was almost no reliable information from him. The Duke looked at the man in surprise and asked if that was all he knew. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that he remembered little. Looking at the Duke, he said that her biological mother had entrusted the child to them at that time, and she had called him priceless. She had then asked him to take very good care of him. He looked at the Duke intently and said that was all he knew. The Duke thought for a moment. He knew that every child was dear to his parents, but he rarely heard a child called priceless. The Duchess looked closely at her husband and with a smile asked him not to hurry. She said that now they are happy just to be with the baby. Some time later, the young lady was sitting and practicing her spelling. Madame looked at her intently and said with a smile that she had written her name on a piece of paper. She asked if she would like to try writing it herself. The young lady looked at her teacher and asked if she had written her name correctly. Madame smiled and told the young lady that she was doing just fine. Madame looked at the young lady intently as the Duchess praised the young lady so much that she even became interested. The Duchess looked at the Viscountess and thanked her with a smile for agreeing to come. The Viscountess smiled and said that she simply could not refuse the Duchess's request. The Viscountess looked at the Duchess and asked if she really wanted the lessons to go slowly. The Duchess smiled and said that was exactly the case, as they had decided to start the lessons because the little girl herself wanted to learn. The Duchess smiled and said that she still thought that it was more important and better for children at that age to play more than to study. The Viscountess looked at the young lady intently as she saw that her desire to learn was simply incredible. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they could now try writing other people's names. The young lady looked at her teacher in confusion and asked if they could start with Julius's brother's name. The Viscountess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to start with his name. A moment later, the Viscountess wrote down the young gentleman's full name. The young lady in turn froze looking at the piece of paper. The Viscountess looked at the young lady intently, for she knew that anyone at her age would be in love with the young gentleman. She thought it was very sweet. For a moment she thought that the Duchess was even thinking about adopting hers. The Viscountess looked closely at the young lady as she saw that she was still a small child. She said with a smile that next she would write the Duke's full name. Roro was very happy. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if they could really go out into the city. Anne looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they would soon go out into the city as they would need to buy some things for Mr. Andrea, and at the same time see what was happening on the streets. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if this was her first time going to the city. Roro said that it was, and she was really looking forward to it. The maid said with a smile that she was also very excited. Roro looked at the maid intently and asked where she would like to go first in the city. Enji, looking at the young lady, said that she would not go with her, but with the mistress and the Duke. The young lady looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked why she was so excited. Then, the maid looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was looking forward to her getting ready to go out. The young lady was surprised, looked at the maid, and asked why she was getting ready. The maid said with a smile that the first appearance in society is always celebrated. Anne looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had many styles in mind that she wanted to try on her Roro, looked at the maid in surprise as she didn't expect this. Anne smiled and said that they could begin. The young lady smiled and said that she would also try her best. Sometime later, the Duke knocked on the door and asked the young lady if she was ready to go out. The Duchess smiled and said that there was still enough time, so they could take their time. Andrea, in turn, wanted to quickly go out to the young lady in the room. The maid looked out from behind the door and with a smile looked intently at everyone present. She said that they should wait a little. The maid looked at the gentleman with a smile and said that they had just finished preparing the young lady for her exit. Andrea quickly ran up to the young lady. He smiled and said that he had come for her. He stood there embarrassed and looked at her in shock. He asked if she was ready. Everyone looked at the young lady intently, unable to take their eyes off her. The Duchess froze in shock, as she did not expect to see such a thing. Andrea looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she was very cute. But today she became even cuter. The young lady looked at the young master with a smile and thanked him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that there was an expression to use at times like these. She looked at him in surprise and asked what the expression was. He looked at her intently and said that he will not give your little sister to anyone. Everyone present froze in shock looking at the young master. The Duchess approached her son and asked with a smile where he had heard such a thing. He looked intently at his mother and said that they say that such lines are in the novels that the maids read. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in surprise. She did not understand to whom he did not want to give her. The Duke, with the speed of lightning, lifted the young lady into his arms and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with a smile and agreed with him. Andrea looked at the young lady intently and asked if all this was surprising to her. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was her first time in such a place. He smiled and said that she could only follow him, and there would be many interesting things there. The Duke looked closely at his son, as he was glad that they were having fun. He looked closely at the young lady, for he knew that he had to make sure that she did not suspect anything. They all looked at each other intently, since in fact the purpose of their trip was not just to take a walk. The Duke looked at his wife closely and said that he heard that the little one had started classes from today. The Duchess said with a smile that the Viscountess had been her close friend since she was a student at the academy, so she was sure that the Viscountess would take good care of the young lady. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said with a smile that he was very glad. The Duchess thought for a moment and told her husband that after that incident, she still thought that the young lady did not have a single thing of her own in their house. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that everything the young lady had used and worn all this time were things bought in case they had a daughter. But unfortunately, they did not belong to Rosny. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that since she had no things of her own, the maids might think that this child would not stay in this house for long. The Duke sighed heavily and looked puzzled, saying that he had unfortunately not thought of that. The Duchess smiled, and looking at her husband, she said that she proposed to take the children with them in the morning and go shopping. She looked closely at her husband and asked what he thought about this. The Duke's face changed with lightning speed, and he looked at his wife with a smile. He said that it was simply an excellent idea. He looked at his wife intently and thoughtfully, asked if the young lady would not refuse the trip if they said that they were going to buy things for her. The Duchess looked at her husband intently and said that she had an idea. She smiled looking at her husband and said that they would tell the young lady that they would go and look at things for Andrea. Later, they wanted to tell her that she had to match the dress code with Andrea, and under this pretext, they would show her outfits. They knew that among everything, there would be something that she would definitely like. They understood perfectly well that everything was going according to their intended plan. The Duchess looked at the young lady and asked her if she liked the hat. She said that it would certainly suit her. She also told the young lady to look at her lovely shoes as they were very pretty. Andrea walked up to his little sister and said with a smile that she could look at some of the ribbons, as they would suit her very well. The young lady in turn stood there in confusion. She didn't know what to do. She glanced sideways at the Duke. The Duke looked closely at his family and told them both to stop as the young lady was very scared from such pressure. Roro sighed heavily as she was glad that the Duke saved her. He looked at them closely and, lifting the dress, said that the young lady said that this outfit was her favorite. Andrea looked at his father in surprise and asked if she really said such a thing. Roro Z froze in shock on the spot. Andrea looked at his sister intently and asked her what she liked better, what her brother had chosen or what the Duke had chosen. He asked what about the hairpin if she didn't want the hat. The young lady was shocked as they had told her that they were going shopping for her brother. She didn't understand why they were asking her so intently about everything. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting quietly near the Duchess with a beautiful ribbon in her hands. The Duchess looked at the young lady intently and asked if there was nothing she liked. Roro walked and, looking at the Duchess, timidly said that everything was beautiful. She thought for a moment and said that they came here to buy things for her little brother, so she didn't think that those clothes would suit him. Andrea was shocked because he didn't expect to hear something like that. Andrea looked at the young lady intently and said that he was always with her, and if she liked something, he liked it too, so she could choose what she wanted. The young lady thought for a moment and said that in that case she would choose something. He looked at her intently as he was in anticipation. She looked at her brother with a smile and asked if he liked the bow. She smiled and said that it would suit him very well. Andrea froze in shock. He sighed heavily and said that, if she wanted, they would take him. The Duke and Duchess exchanged glances. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had chosen something that would suit Andrea. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that now they could choose something for her too. The young lady froze in place for a moment. She looked at the Duke in surprise and said that they had already given her a beautiful ribbon. She said that they had already given her a lot. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently and said that this was not the case, and he wanted his image to match hers. He looked at her intently and said that then everyone would know that she was his sister. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that she should choose first, and then he would pick something to match her image. She timidly said that she could not choose what she wanted. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, but did not answer. He glanced sideways at the young lady and said that in that case nothing could be done. He looked at the saleswoman and told her to pack him a whole rack of things for the young lady. He looked at them intently and said that he would pay for everything. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the Duke in surprise and called him. He smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that there would be no other way out because he did not know what she liked. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the Duke intently and said that if he spent so much, it would bring him great trouble. The Duke in turn looked at her intently, but did not answer. A moment later, he said with a smile that they would really benefit from her opinion. Roro was shocked. She did not expect this and did not want it at all. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she could say what she liked. He smiled and said that if he found out what she liked, he would definitely buy the item. The young lady in turn looked at him timidly. She thought, not knowing what to answer, and glanced sideways at the beautiful shoes. Andrea, with the speed of lightning, rose, and looking at his father, said that the young lady liked the shoes, the ones he offered. Roro looked at her brother with a puzzled expression and said that it was not so. The Duchess looked at her intently and said that she saw that the young lady liked the shoes. Rosny hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She saw the intent looks of all those present, and a moment later she said that it was so, and she liked the shoes very much. They looked at the young lady with admiring smiles, as they were glad that she had given them a positive answer. The saleswoman looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was a very good choice. The Duchess smiled, looking at the lady, and said that she had chosen very beautiful shoes. A moment later, the young gentleman put on the bow she had given him and said with a smile that they now looked like a couple. The young lady looked closely at her brother and said with a smile that it suited him very well. The saleswoman looked closely at the cute children as she saw that they were very charming. She smiled and said that in that case, they could pack everything carefully for them. The Duke came closer to the saleswoman and quietly told her to pack clothes that could go with the shoes. He said she had to do it without the baby noticing. The saleswoman said she would try, but she didn't know if she could. Andrea looked at his sister with a smile and said that if they go the other way, there will be a market street. The young lady looked at her brother surprised. Andrea looked at the street food in surprise. He looked closely at his mother, as he wanted her to give him her approval. But the Duchess firmly refused him. She looked at her son closely and said that it was almost dinner time. She looked at him worriedly and asked if he was really going to eat all this and not eat anything else. He said that he was not a child at all. The young lady sighed heavily as there was a very delicious smell near the food. The young gentleman quickly grabbed his sister by the hand and said that they should go in another direction. The Duchess was shocked. She shouted at her son not to run too fast. They ran out into the street very quickly and did not notice the carriage that was rushing along at lightning speed. The young master quickly reacted and pushed the young lady away. Fortunately, nothing happened and they remained safe. The Dukes ran up to the children with lightning speed and asked if they were hurt. She was very worried and wanted to know if they were okay. He looked closely at his mother and said with a smile that everything was okay and he was not hurt. The Duke looked at his son with fury and said that if he ran again, they would go home. He looked at his father excitedly and said that he would not run anymore. He asked his father if he could walk around a little longer and look at everything. The young lady froze in shock as she saw her ribbon flying away. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to her ribbon as she wanted to take it back. She was in shock as she knew that her maid had tried very hard to braid it. She ran into the alley and froze in place, looking around. She was puzzled because she did not see her ribbon. A moment later, she heard someone's voice and froze in shock. The young man looked at her intently and asked if this was what she was looking for. He came closer to her and said with a smile that it looked like her ribbon. Rosny looked at the boy in surprise and thanked him. She reached for the ribbon, but he suddenly raised his hand. The young lady looked at him in surprise because he did not give her the ribbon. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. He smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she was very sweet, so he wanted to joke around with her a little for a day. He smiled and handed her the ribbon. He said she could have it. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was not taking it because she wanted to stay with him longer. She sheepishly said that this was not so and took her ribbon back with lightning speed. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was just a joke. At the same time, he called her by name. He said that she just reminded him of his little sister. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she was surprised that he knew her name. The young man stood timidly in place. She looked at him intently and in a trembling voice said that he had called her name. A moment later, they heard a noise, and he asked her with a smile if it was time for her to go back. He smiled and pointed to the exit. He said that she shouldn't be so curious about him. A moment later, the young lady turned around and saw that she was alone. She froze for a moment as he said that they would meet again soon. She was surprised as he knew her name. She wondered if he was in the orphanage. She realized that this was not the case, as he called her by a different name, one that she had in the orphanage. She wondered if this was just a fleeting dream. Lady decided to push her thoughts away and ran to the exit. The Duke looked at the young lady with excitement and called her. Rosny looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke in turn was very worried. He asked if she was okay and if she was hurt anywhere. She looked at him closely and said that she was fine and not hurt anywhere. The Duke in turn breathed a sigh of relief. A moment later, everyone else ran up to them. The Duchess, with the speed of lightning, hugged the young lady tightly. She was very glad that everything was all right with her. Andrea looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and asked for forgiveness. He said that he was holding her hand, and then she suddenly disappeared. Roro looked at the young gentleman with confusion and said that everything was fine and nothing terrible had happened. Andrea in turn was very frightened and puzzled that he could not protect her. She sighed heavily and looking at the young gentleman said that it all happened because of her. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that it was not a dream. She hugged the very strong Duchess with tears in her eyes. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile how today's walk had gone. Roro smiled at the maid and said that Madame and the Duke had bought her some beautiful shoes. Looking at the maid, she said that she would like to show them to her. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that today she saw a boy who showed her the way, but unfortunately, as soon as she turned around, he disappeared. She wondered if she had just imagined him. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it could have just been an elf. Roro thought for a moment about what the maid had told her and looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that there are legends that if a child gets into trouble, an elf or fairies will come to his aid. The young lady in turn was surprised and happy. She said that it seemed that it really was an elf. She thought for a moment as she remembered the boy she knew perfectly well that he was very handsome. She thought as he matched the description of an elf. She thought about what he had told her, that they would definitely meet. For a moment, she thought about her older brother and thought that he was cooler than the elf. The young lady in turn was in shock. She did not understand why she remembered her brother again. A moment later, the butler entered their room and apologized for disturbing them. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to see him. He smiled looking at the young lady and said that they had guests, and they were very eager to see her. Roro looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him sharply and asked if the Marquise had really come to visit them again. He smiled and said that it was not so. Some time later, the Duke and Duchess were greeting guests in the drawing room. His Highness the Crown Prince and his family came to visit them. The Crown Prince's daughter, Princess Bianca, looked at the young master and asked if he really meant to say that the girl was cuter than her. Andrea looked at the princess intently and said that it was exactly like that she was so cute that if the princess saw her right now, she would see it for herself. The princess thought for a moment and said that she was very interested to see what she was like. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if she would not eat dinner after dessert again. A moment later, the butler announced that the young lady had come to them. Andrea rose as he wanted to see his sister. The princess looked at the young lady intently, for she knew that she was the fairest of all. But when the young lady came closer to her, she froze in shock. Roro looked at everyone present and politely greeted them and also introduced herself. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was really nice. She looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that it seemed her dream had come true. The Duchess smiled and said that it was exactly like that. The madam looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she could be a good friend to Bianca Roro. Looked at the madam in surprise, as she didn't know who Bianca was. The princess ran closer to the young lady and said with a smile that she was just a doll, or rather an angel. The princess was shocked. She didn't understand how the young lady's hands could be so cute and small. Andrea ran up to them with lightning speed and told the princess to stop touching his sister. He shouted that sister was only his. The princess smiled and said that she too had a time when she was just as small and cute. The young master looked at the princess in surprise and said that she was only a year older than their Roro. Those present were touched, looking at the children. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she could call her Bibi. Rosny looked at the young lady intently. The princess in turn looked at her and said that she was really cute. Roro was shocked as she realized that the girl in front of her was a real princess. The Duke looked at the Crown Prince in surprise and asked why only the princess had arrived. The Crown Prince smiled and said that his son would arrive soon. A moment later, the butler informed the Crown Prince that he had brought his son. The young lady looked away in surprise as she did not expect to see the prince. The princess looked away in surprise as she did not expect her brother to arrive. The prince looked at everyone intently and said with a smile that he was very pleased to meet everyone. He slowly walked up to the young lady and kissed her hand with a smile. He looked at her with a smile and said that she could just call him Henry. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in shock as she thought he was an elf. The princess looked at the young lady intently and thanked her for the wonderful gift. She looked at the drawing in surprise, as she did not understand how handwriting could be so cute and beautiful. She sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that her brother said that her handwriting looked like earthworms. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she looked at the princess and said that she had very beautiful and cute handwriting. The princess smiled and asked if she really had such handwriting. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was cuter than her Roro. In turn looked at the princess with an embarrassed smile and said that she was much cuter than her. The Viscountess sat and quietly sipped tea, looking at the young ladies. The princess looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she was very nice, not that she, the Viscountess in turn, choked on her tea. The princess looked at the young lady closely and said, "She was once this small and cute, but now she was too old." Roro looked at the princess with embarrassment and said that she was really cute. The Viscountess was shocked, since the age difference between the young ladies was only 1 year. The Viscountess looked closely at the young ladies, as it seemed to her that the pace of the young ladies' studies had slowed down a little, due to the princess's origin. She looked closely at the young ladies, as she knew that this was what made the little girl laugh. The young lady looked at the princess intently, and said that she would like to know something. She asked the princess what kind of toy was on her lap. The princess looked at her doll in surprise. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this doll was a gift from her father. She asked if Roro would like to hold the doll. Rosny said shyly that she would like to take a closer look at it. The young lady was stunned by the beauty of the doll. She looked at it intently. She saw that the doll was very similar to a princess, as it was soft and gentle. The princess looked at the young lady intently and asked if she didn't have a doll. Roro, in turn, hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The princess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she could ask the duke for a doll, as he could buy her at least 100 of the same dolls. The young lady said with a smile that it was okay if she didn't have a doll. Looking at the princess, she said with a smile that she had already received enough from the duke. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked if she should really ask the duke, instead of her, Roro. O walked away, and looking at the princess said that there was no need for that. Some time later, the prince entered their room. He looked intently at his sister, and breathing heavily, asked if she was disrupting the lesson again. The Viscountess sighed heavily as she realized that since the prince had come to them, it meant that the lesson was definitely over. Bianca looked at her brother in surprise and said that she had received permission from the teacher. The prince looked at his sister and said that she must have simply demanded it rather than asked. The young lady, in turn, shyly walked closer to the prince and greeted him. He smiled and looked at Roro. With a smile said that there was no need for a formal greeting. He looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he really wanted her to feel comfortable with him. The princess, in turn, looked at her brother. She did not understand why he suddenly became so friendly. She froze in shock as she looked at her brother, as she saw that even his ears had turned red. She slowly walked up to her brother and called him with a sly smile on her face. The prince was taken aback, and looking at his sister asked what kind of expression she had on her face now. She looked at her brother with a smile. He looked at her with a smile and said that they could change the subject. He asked her not to say anything. Bianca looked at her brother closely and said with a smile that it was very noticeable. The prince sighed heavily and said that she could just not say anything. Roro, in turn, looked at them closely. She looked at them with a smile and said that the prince and princess apparently had a very good relationship. The princess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she was really still very little and did not notice anything. The prince looked closely at the young lady, for she was indeed exactly as his friend had described in his letter. He was moving slowly in the carriage when he suddenly noticed a young lady. He noticed that she was very confused and asked the coachman to stop the carriage for a while. He in turn thought for a moment, since he did not expect at all that she would be much nicer than his friend described her. The prince looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had heard that she was studying music. She smiled and said that it was so, and she began to study the notation of the notes. He smiled and said that to read and write notes well, you need to listen to a lot of good music. The prince looked at the Viscountess and said with a smile that he thought he could help the young lady a little. He smiled, looking at the Viscountess, and asked if he could help her. The Viscountess smiled and thanked the prince and also approved of his efforts. Looking at the pensions, she said that she thought it would help her a lot. The princess smiled as she looked at her friend and said that her brother was very good at playing the piano. The young lady said with a smile that she was really looking forward to his performance. A moment later, the prince began to play beautiful music. The music slowly flew away from the ducks of the room. Young Lady Z froze in surprise on the spot. She enjoyed the beautiful music as it was the first time in her life that she had heard such a beautiful sound. She was amazed because the music was so beautiful that it even made her heart beat faster. She thought for a moment, as she remembered that her heart had been beating just as hard that time. She thought about everything for a while, and realized that it was a little different then. The Viscountess looked at the prince and said with a smile that he had indeed performed beautiful music. Roro looked at the prince with a look of surprise and said that she had never heard such a wonderful performance before. Rosny. She asked how he could create such beautiful sounds. The prince in turn was embarrassed by such praise. He smiled and said that it was all because he had studied music diligently. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that if she wanted, he could send her the teacher who taught him. Roro looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and said that since this teacher had taught the imperial family, since ancient times, he thought that she would teach the young lady well. She was shocked, and looking at the prince, she asked if she could really be taught by such a person. Andrea entered their room. The young gentleman looked at his little sister with a smile and said that he had come. But a moment later, he froze in place as he saw that the prince was holding his sister by the cheeks. The young gentleman looked at the prince in surprise and confusion. He did not understand why he was touching her without permission. The prince was taken aback and asked for forgiveness with a smile. He said that he should have asked first. The prince looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if he could touch her cheeks. Andrea rushed to the prince and was embarrassed to say that he had to ask his permission. The prince was shocked. He shouted that the young lady was not his thing to ask his permission. Andrea, in turn, shouted that he and only he could touch his sister. The young ladies, in turn, watched this spectacle intently. The prince smiled, looking at Roro, and said that she had allowed him. Andrea, in turn, was shocked and shouted that he had not allowed anyone anything. The princess looked at them intently and had a good time. The Viscountess also looked at the children with a smile. They quickly pounced on the young lady, since they could not share her. Some time later, the young lady returned to her room. She thought for a moment, as every day passed very happily. She thought for a moment that if the Duchess found out that the prince had decided to send her a music teacher, she would probably be surprised. Rosny knew that she had to tell the Duchess about this as soon as possible. But a moment later, as she passed the Duchess's room, she heard her conversation. The Duchess sighed heavily, and looking at her sister, said that she was very worried, and that she felt that the imperial family was running out of divine power. She sighed heavily and said that, even though this was the case, it was impossible to contact His Highness the Crown Prince. She said that, even if it was the Countess, the difference in status was too great. A moment later, they heard some noise outside the door. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing at such a late hour. The young lady looked at the Duchess intently and asked in a puzzled tone who this Countess of Castile was of whom they had recently spoken. The young lady in turn overheard their conversation and would like to know a little more about the Countess. The Duchess in turn froze. She did not know how to answer this question. Countess of Castile, aka Madame Miller, she shielded the eyes and ears of the Emperor, his mistress, and an influential man who runs the imperial palace. And besides, she is a woman who weaves all sorts of intrigues. She does everything to put her son on the throne. The Duchess looked at the young lady intently. She did not know how she should answer the child's question. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that, as was already clear from what had been said, she was a countess that is the wife of a count. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that the countess learns and can do a lot, which is why she now works in the imperial palace. Roro looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that she remembered everything, since after the Duke comes the Marquis, and after the Marquis comes the Count. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very smart. The Duchess sighed heavily, as she was glad that everything worked out. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she came to her. The young lady smiled and said that the prince said that he would come and send her a music teacher. The ladies looked at Roro in surprise. The young lady smiled and said that the prince said that the teacher taught the princess to play the piano. Madame thought for a moment, and looking at the young lady asked what the teacher's name was. Roro thought for a moment, as she had forgotten the name. Looking at the Duchess, she only named the first letter of the name. Madame looked closely at the young lady, as she knew many persons. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that if she wanted to play with the prince and princess tomorrow, she would have to go to bed early. The young lady was taken aback and wished them good night. As she left, she kept thinking about the countess. She thought for a moment, because she knew for sure that she had heard it for the first time, and she didn't know the woman's new name at all. She was a little worried and confused, as she did not understand why she felt such pain in her chest. The next day, the prince and the young master practiced fencing. Andrea, with lightning speed, caught up with the prince and struck him, but he in turn looked intently at the young gentleman with a sly smile on his face. With lightning speed, the prince parried the young master's blow, and he fell to the ground. The prince looked at the young man with a grin and asked if this meant that he had won. Andrea was furious and shouted at the prince that he did not agree because he had broken the rules. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked what other violation. He said that they both fought on equal terms and with the same weapons. Andrea was shocked. He could not object to the prince. Leon slowly approached the young gentleman and handed him water and a towel. Andrea looked at the young man intently and in surprise and thanked him. Leon also slowly approached the prince and asked him to take a towel. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and thanked him with a smile. Andrea thought about the young man for a moment, because when he first saw him, he thought he was very boring since he spoke little. Add him intently, Leon, because he knew that he followed his orders very well and also always brought snacks. Andrea thought he was nicer than he thought. He patted the boy on the shoulder with a smile. A moment later, the princess looked at all the young people present and greeted them with a smile. She said that they had come to see them. The prince did not pay attention to his sister, but immediately looked at the young lady. He asked her with a smile what brought them to them. Leon in turn looked intently at the young lady. Andrea looked at the young man in surprise. He didn't understand the sudden expression on his face. He looked at his sister intently and wondered in surprise if Leon really liked his sister. He was shocked. The prince ran up to the young lady and asked with a smile if she had come to see him. Andreas, with lightning speed, took the place of the prince, and looking at his sister, asked if she had really come to see him. But a moment later, he froze in place and looked at his sister in surprise, as he did not understand what had happened. He looked at her in surprise and said that she looked very worried. He asked, puzzled, if someone had said something to her again. The young lady looked at her brother intently and said that everything was fine and nothing had happened. The prince and princess also looked at the young lady intently. They wanted to know if nothing had happened to her. Andrea looked closely at his sister and said with a satisfied smile that then, especially for his tired sister, he would show her what he had been training until now. Some time later, he began his fencing training. The young lady looked at her brother with admiration. She knew that he was now going to show everyone his abilities. She ran up to her brother and said with a smile that he was just great. Andrea froze in place. He was very happy that she praised him. The young lady looked at the princess intently and asked with a smile if she liked the training. Bibi looked at her in surprise. A moment later, the princess said with embarrassment that it was quite good. The young gentleman approached his sister and said with a smile that she seemed to like it very much, but the prince stopped him, not letting him pass. The prince looked at the young gentleman intently and asked if he had completely forgotten about their agreement. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that today, the right to the young lady's cheeks belongs to him. Rorozi froze in surprise. On the spot, she could not utter a word, since she did not understand what was happening at all. Andrea was shocked. He looked at the prince and said that his sister's face was her property. He did not understand why should it belong to the prince. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and said that just yesterday, he himself said that he needed to ask him for permission to Roro. My lady was shocked and did not understand why they suddenly started quarreling. Andrea looked at the prince intently and said that the young lady belonged only to herself, and only those whom she herself allowed could touch her. The prince looked at the young gentleman with a grin and said that his stubbornness was useless. Rosny slowly approached her brother and excitedly asked him not to quarrel with the prince. Andrea, with lightning speed, took her by the shoulders and began to shake her. He wanted her to speak herself. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked what she should say. He looked at her intently and said excitedly that she should tell him who her cheeks really belonged to. The lady in turn froze in place from shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at everyone present and asked what they were talking about. The young gentleman looked intently at his sister and asked again to whom her cheeks belonged. The prince looked at the young man with a smirk and asked if he should not be asking this question since he had won the bet. Andrea was furious. He shouted at the prince that this was not so and that he had won the bet unfairly. Andrea was shocked because he remembered that they had argued about this recently. The prince looked at him intently and said that if he won, he would give him the sword he wanted. Andrea was very happy and fell for the bet. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she did not need to worry, because if she did not want to, he would never touch her. He said that her cheeks should not be touched by everyone. Andrea sighed heavily and said that he said the same thing. Andrea looked at the young lady intently and said that she had to choose. Rosny was in shock and did not understand what was going on at all. Andrea in turn looked intently at the young lady. He knew that she would definitely choose him since he was her brother. The prince in turn knew for sure that she would choose him, since during all this time he had shown himself on his good side. Leon looked at the young lady with bewilderment, waiting for her answer. The young lady looked at everyone present with embarrassment. She didn't know what to say. The princess in turn watched everything closely. It seemed to her that they were in a romance. She nudged her lady and said with a smile that she should choose quickly since everyone was waiting. A moment later, they looked into the distance as they saw the Duke. The young lady in turn was very glad that the Duke came to them as he saved the situation. The Duke slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that the knights needed to train so they could come into the house. Roro slowly pulled the Duke by the suit. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what happened. A moment later, the young lady shouted out loud and asked the Duke to become the master of her cheeks. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at the Duke intently and said that he could touch her cheeks at any time. The young men froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear such a thing from her. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He said that they know what they are playing here, but he is very glad that she chose him. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had prepared a cake for her. She looked at him in surprise and asked happily if it was true. She smiled and said that she was looking forward to tasting it. The princess looked at the young men with a grin. She saw that they were very upset. The princess looked closely at her brother and with a satisfied grin told him that he should hold on. She came closer to him and said with a smile that if you look at it objectively, the Duke is cooler than him. The prince sighed heavily and looking at his sister said that her words did not console him at all. He looked at the young people with bewilderment. He sighed heavily as he expected her to choose him. The crown prince looked at the Duke closely and smiled and told him to be careful. The Duchess looked at the crown princess with a smile and told her not to worry, as she would do everything in her power to help her. Seelin looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she had already said this. She asked the Duchess not to worry about it. The princess sighed in surprise. She said that adults were very strange. She knew that they would see each other later, but she did not understand why she was so sad then. The young lady looked at the princess with confusion and called her Bianca, looked at the young lady with a smile and asked what happened. Roro looked at the princess intently and asked if this meant that they could still meet. Roro looked at the princess with embarrassment and said that if she was busy, of course they wouldn't be able to meet, but nevertheless she would like to meet her again. She looked at the princess with a smile and said that she really enjoyed spending time with her. A moment later, the princess ran up to the young lady with a smile and hugged her tightly. Bianca looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she too had enjoyed spending time with her. Bianca smiled and said that now they were friends, so they would definitely meet again and have fun playing. Bianca looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that, when they meet again, she should also bring her doll, since playing with dolls is very interesting. The young lady agreed with a smile. The prince in turn watched the young ladies closely. Andrea looked at the prince in surprise and asked what happened. He looked at the prince in confusion and asked if he was still coveting his sister's cheek. Andrea said that he shouldn't do that. The prince looked at the young gentleman with a smile and said that he could think whatever he wanted, and called him Little Lord. Andrea was shocked by the prince's behavior. The prince slowly approached the young lady and with a smile placed a beautiful band in her palm. He smiled and told her lady that they would definitely meet again, and next time he would give her something better. The young lady in turn looked intently at the gift she had just received from the prince. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise as she saw that she was upset. The Duchess smiled and told the little girl not to worry, as they would meet again soon. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a gaze and said with a smile that she must have been very upset. Roro, in turn, did not say anything, but her expression spoke for itself. A moment later, the young lady came closer to the Duchess and, sighing heavily, said that she had had a lot of fun with the princess and that the prince was also a very good man. Andrea came closer to the young lady and stroked her head with a smile. He said that she could forget about the prince because she had a brother. The Duchess looked closely at Roro, as she never thought that she would be the first to speak out what was on her mind. Previously, she always hid her feelings and was the first to only apologize. The Duchess tenderly embraced the young lady and kissed her on the forehead. The Duchess smiled and told the girl that if she missed the princess, she could definitely tell her at any time. The Duchess smiled at the young lady and said that in that case they would go and visit her together. The young lady looked at everyone present. She knew that they were very good people. She wondered what she should do since she really wanted to stay with them. She looked at everyone present and asked for a moment of attention. They looked at her in surprise. Roro looked at them with a smile and said that she would always be grateful to them. She smiled a radiant smile, looking at everyone, and thanked them for making her happy every day. Everyone present froze because the young lady was very sweet, and they could see this spectacle with their own eyes. She thought for a moment, as she thought that the crown princess was right after all. The crown princess looked at the Duchess intently and asked with a smile if the young lady really had supernatural powers. Since she was cute in everyone's eyes, the Duchess could now confirm this. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said that they were also very pleased with her words. She asked her if she would like to have tea together before the lesson. Andrea smiled and said that he would very much like to have tea with them. A moment later, a servant ran up to them and called the Duke. The servant was alarmed and told the Duke that he had urgent news. He approached the Duke and quietly whispered something in his ear. The Duke's face changed with lightning speed. He was surprised, and looking at the servant asked who had come to their estate. The young lady looked intently at the Duke as she saw that he was worried. The servant hesitated, but a moment later, he said that a woman had come to them who claimed to be the young lady's natural mother. He said that the woman had asked for an audience with the Duke. The Duke thought for a moment, as this situation was very unexpected. He sighed heavily, and looking at his wife, said that the woman did not look for the girl while she was in the shelter. But as soon as Rosny entered the family, she immediately became interested in her. He looked closely at his wife and said excitedly that unfortunately he had a bad feeling. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise as he saw that she was very upset, very much excited and puzzled as they were informed that the woman who came also had the same hair as their young lady. She was agitated and wondered if the woman was really the young lady's own mother. The Duchess thought about the fact that the woman might have had circumstances and no other choice but to leave her daughter in the orphanage. She understood perfectly well that the young lady could understand her mother and accept her. She was excited because she thought that the young lady still wanted to be with her real mother. The Duke shouted and called his wife since she was flying somewhere in the clouds and did not hear him. The Duke came up to his wife and with a gentle smile said that she did not need to worry about anything. He smiled and said that nothing was known for sure yet. He sighed heavily and said that first they needed to meet with that woman. The Duke looked closely at the servant and asked where the woman was now. The servant sighed heavily and looking at the master said that he had taken her to the living room. The Duke gave him a cold look and said that he would go and meet her. Looking at the servant, the Duke told him to find out about the woman as quickly as possible in the meantime. Andrea in turn shouted that he was very bored. He was shocked because the tea party was suddenly cancelled, and he really wanted to eat pasta. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and called him. She looked at him with a smile and said that Madame said that a very important guest had come. She looked at him and said that if he went there, he could have some tea. The young gentleman looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he stood up and looking at his little sister, said that he wanted to ask her something. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked why she called her mother Madam. The young lady was taken aback, and looking at him asked what he was talking about. Andrea looked at her intently and said that the butler and the maid called Mother Madam. But it was very strange that she also called her. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, they heard some noise. The Duchess knocked on their door and asked if she could come in. The young lady smiled and told the Duchess that she could come in. The Duchess looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she had been waiting for her for so long. Lucia looked at her son and said that she needed to talk to Roro. She asked if he could go out for a while. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he couldn't listen. The Duchess looked at her son intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that they would talk to the young lady for a short time. Andrea sighed heavily, but still agreed. He looked closely at his mother and said that as soon as they finished, they should definitely call them. The Duchess smiled, looking at her son, and said that she would definitely call him. The young lady looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked what she wanted to talk to her about. The Duchess hesitated, looking at the young lady. She did not know how to begin the conversation. A moment later, the Duchess approached the young lady and gently took her hand. She was moved, asked if she remembered her own mother's face. Rosny looked sadly at the Duchess and said that, unfortunately, she did not remember. The Duchess hesitated for a moment, but a couple of minutes later, she told the young lady that it was actually her biological mother who had come to their estate. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said that, unfortunately, they still had to find out whether she really was who she said she was. She looked at the young lady and asked if she had another name. Kim was not her name at the orphanage. The young lady shook her head and said she had not. She asked the Duchess's forgiveness and said she regretted she could not remember. Roro Droja looked at the Duchess and said that she remembered that her mother left her at the orphanage and that, unfortunately, she didn't remember anything else. The Duchess looked at Rosny intently and asked if she wanted to meet that woman. Roro R was confused and did not know what to answer. The lady entered the room and greeted the Duke with a polite smile. She said that her name was Louisa Bennet. He looked at the lady intently and asked if Rosny was her child. Louise looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand who he was talking about. She hesitated for a moment and answered positively, as she realized that the girl had been given a new name. Louise sighed heavily and said that her original name was Chloe. She said with sadness in her voice that this name was given to her by her late husband. She looked closely at the legs in play and said that, for this reason, when she left her at the shelter, she gave her the name Ronnie, as it was similar to Chloe. The Duke looked closely at the lady and asked if she herself had left her at the shelter. Louise sighed heavily, and with tears in her eyes, said that everything was exactly like that, since her life at that time was very difficult, and for this reason, she personally took her to the shelter. She considered this place quite reliable at that time. She said that, unfortunately, she could not think that people could be so evil and cruel. She was very surprised when she learned about the director's arrest, but it turned out that a very good person of high status took her child, and in addition, he took her under guardianship. She looked at the Duke intently and said that he was the child of a despicable woman. The Duke in turn looked at her lady with fury. Louise looked at the Duke with a smile and thanked him. The Duke looked at her closely as he saw that she had the same hair color as the young lady. And besides, she knew about the orphanage. He realized that there was a certain possibility that she could be Rosny's biological mother. He was puzzled that she would come looking for the baby as soon as she had been given custody by the Duke's family. He knew that even if she was the girl's biological mother, he had no reason to give Rosny to her. However, he understood that if the young lady herself wanted to be with her own mother, he would not be able to resist her decision. A moment later, a servant informed the Duke that a young lady had come to see them. The Duke sighed heavily and told his servant to let her in. Rosny walked slowly into the room. She was excited and called out to the Duke in a trembling voice. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she could come closer. Rosny Z froze in place as she saw a woman who was trembling. A moment later, the lady rushed towards Rosny and called her. With lightning speed, Louise hugged the young lady. Roro Z froze in place from shock. As she did not expect this, she did not know how to act. She looked at the woman in surprise and asked if she was her mother. Louise trembled as she hugged the young lady and called her Roro Z. Froze in shock, she could not utter a word. The Duchess took the woman's hand and pulled it back a little. The Duchess looked closely at the lady and asked if she couldn't see that Roro was very scared. The Duchess looked at the lady intently and said that even if she was her own mother, she should not touch her whenever she pleased. Louise looked at the Duchess intently. She was trembling and crying. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she must be confused now, but he still had one question for her. He looked at her intently and asked if she remembered anything about the name Chloe Roro. Froze in place in surprise, she didn't know what to answer. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she didn't remember anything. Louise looked at the young lady intently and asked for forgiveness. She could not talk to her because she was crying so much. She spoke in Roro and said that she was very sorry that her mother came to her too late. Roro, in turn, looked at her intently, but did not answer. She was puzzled because she thought that she would be very happy to meet her mother. But just like then, in front of the director of the orphanage, now she was also scared and bad. Louise looked at the young lady intently and asked for forgiveness for frightening her. The Duke looked sideways at his servant and told him to first take them to the guest room. The servant bowed and said that he would certainly do everything. The servant approached the lady and told her to follow him. The lady hesitated and timidly said that she was just very happy to see her daughter. And for this reason, she gave in to emotions. The Duke looked at the young lady closely as he saw that she was confused. He asked if she would like to go to her room and rest a little. The Duke looked at her with a gentle smile and said that he would certainly tell the maid to bring her something to eat. The young lady in turn agreed. Rosny, I walked into the room thinking about this situation. She wondered if her real mother would take her if she really was her real biological mother. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw a young gentleman running towards her. He looked closely at the young lady and asked excitedly if it was true that she was being taken away. She froze in shock and could not utter a word. He shouted and shook her by the shoulders. He wanted to know if it was true. He hoped that she would not leave them. The maid looked at the young master in surprise and excitement and said that nothing had been decided yet. The young master looked at the young lady with sadness and said that the maid said that her real mother had come to their estate. He looked at his little sister intently and asked if she would really go to her if she was her real mother, Roro. In turn, froze in place, not knowing what to answer. The sir walked up to the young master and lifted him up in his arms with lightning speed. He looked at the young master with a smile and said that it was training time and he couldn't skip it and just run away. The young man was taken aback as he didn't expect to see his mentor at all. Sir Cosvenwu went to the training ground with the young master. He said that you can't just give up on your training. The young master shouted at his mentor that training is not the most important thing now. The young master in turn looked at his little sister with tears in his eyes and shouted to her. He did not want her to leave him at all. The young lady looked at him intently. She wondered if she left, she would never be able to see him again. She was very upset because she understood that she would no longer be able to meet with Madame and the Duke. She understood that she would not be able to see her teacher anymore, nor her maid, and she would not be able to see her brother Julius. She was very upset because she really wanted to show him how she had learned to greet people according to etiquette. She wanted to show him all the knowledge she had received. With tears in her eyes, she stood still. The maid walked up to the young lady and looked at her intently. She smiled and said, "The young lady can do as her heart tells her." Anne looked at the lady intently and said with a smile that, of course, she wanted to be with her, but if she was happy like that, then it would be better. Anne looked at Rosny intently and said that she would respect whatever her choice was. The young lady thought for a moment, because all this time she was thinking about parting with all the people living in the estate, but she unfortunately did not even think about living with her mother. She thought about it and froze because she thought about life with her mother. For a moment, she was overcome with a shudder. She was shocked because she had just felt some unknown feelings. She didn't understand what it was. For a while, she wondered what these feelings were, but then she realized that she felt discomfort and fear. Leon slowly walked up to the young lady and called her, "Rosny." Okay looked at her friend, as she did not expect to see him. Leon looked at her intently, with a gentle smile on his face. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was here now. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the Duke had given orders to protect her. He looked at her intently and said that he would protect her from any unforeseen thing that might happen. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what could go wrong. Looking at her friend, she said with a trembling voice that she might soon leave this place, and she didn't want to create such problems. He looked at her closely and said that he would definitely protect her. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he would follow her wherever she went. After looking around, the maid said with a smile that the Duke's family was fundamentally different from all the others, since the guest room and this room were very good. The maid smiled and said that she was glad, even at the thought, that she could spend at least a little time here. The lady looked at the maid and said that the baby did not remember anything from her early childhood. She looked at the maid and asked if this was true. The maid with a smile said that it was exactly so. Louise said with a grin that the girl seemed to have suffered a lot, since she didn't even remember her own mother. She looked at the maid with a grin and said that she had come to take the girl as her biological mother. She told the maid that they needed to try so that the little girl could accept hers. Madame looked at Louise and asked if she would like to see the children first. She said that they were all healthy and energetic, and she was sure to like someone. Louise looked at Madame and asked if she could talk to the boys calmly. Madame looked at her with a smile and said that in that case they could come to them. Louise slowly walked up to the boys and greeted them. She handed them some candy with a smile and asked if they wanted some. The children froze looking at the candies. They looked closely at Louise and thanked her. Louise, in turn, looked at the children with a smile. The lady slowly approached the children and said with a smile that she had heard that, among them, there was a child who went to the Duke's family. They looked at the maid intently and said that it was just like that, for there was a boy named Ronnie who had been taken into the ducal family as a playmate for the young master. She looked at them with a smile and said that he must have been a really cheerful and good child. For a moment, the boys looked at each other and said that the boy was very sullen, and he played alone, washed alone, and slept alone. They looked closely at the lady and said that the boy often had indigestion and always walked alone. The lady looked at them in surprise and asked what it meant that he often had indigestion. The boy sighed heavily and said discontentedly that their friend often went to the toilet alone, but he must have stolen food from the table, which is why he had indigestion. Louise thought for a moment, as she knew that this was all to hide the fact that she was a girl. She looked at the children with a smirk and said that despite the fact that he was such a child, he was taken into a noble aristocratic family. She looked closely at the children and said with a smile that the boy was very lucky. Louise, in turn, understood perfectly well that she was very lucky. She was very happy because she could not imagine that she would be able to get into the Duke's family. She was shocked and did not expect to be treated to such food. The Duchess looked at the lady intently and said that her visit was very sudden, so they had nothing special to treat her with. Louise looked at Madame in surprise and said that there was very expensive and rare food on the table now, and that was enough for her Roro. And Andrea sat quietly at the table without saying a word. Louise looked at the Duchess intently and thanked her. The Duchess froze in shock as she saw Lady greedily eating all the dishes. The Duchess looked at the lady intently and said that she must be very hungry. Louise stood frozen in place. She did not know what to say to her. A moment later, she timidly said that she grew up in a very poor family, so this was the first time she had seen such expensive and rare food. Roro looked at Louise in surprise. Andrea prepared a dish for the young lady. He cut her into pieces of meat, and with a smile told her to look. She smiled and said that she loved this dish, and he cut it for her. He smiled and said that she should try it, as it was very tasty. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she had heard that her dessert today would be her favorite strawberry tartare. The young lady thanked the Duchess with a smile. Louise slowly handed the plate with the dish to the young lady and, asking for forgiveness, told her that it was the first time she had eaten such food, so she had not taken care of it. She said with a smile that now she would take care of it for all the time she had not done so. The young lady thanked Louise. The Duke sighed heavily, but a moment later, a servant approached him. He looked closely at the Duke and asked if he could be called away for a minute. The servant looked at the Duke intently and said that, unfortunately, They had something very urgent to discuss. At the same time, Louise greedily ate the dish. The Duchess looked at everyone present and said with a smile that unfortunately they had urgent business to attend to, so they would go. She smiled, looking at the children, and said that they could continue their meal. She looked at Louise intently and said that when they were finished, she should return to her room. Louise rose from her chair with lightning speed, and looking at the Duchess agreed, and also thanked her. Louise looked at her daughter with a smile on her face. Andrea wondered for a moment if his sister really wanted to leave. He was very sad, because he hadn't even played enough with her. A moment later, he jumped up from his chair, and looking at his sister, said that they should play. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such behavior. He smiled and said that everything was fine, and they could play now. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady glanced sideways at Louise. She saw that Louise continued to eat greedily, not paying any attention to them. The Duke thought for a moment, looking at the documents as he realized that Louise was not lying, and her identity was not a lie. The servant looked closely at the Duke and said that the lady's name was indeed Louise. Her status in society and place of residence were the same. The Duke looked at the servant in surprise and asked if she had visited the orphanage for adoption. Looking at the gentleman, the servant said that the director of the orphanage himself had accompanied her to the children. The Duke thought for a moment and said that it would be natural to visit the orphanage to find her child, but not for adoption. The servant looked at the master intently and said that perhaps she had gone to the orphanage to get information about the young lady, using the adoption as an excuse. The Duke froze in place at this information. He remembered the feeling of discomfort he had felt back then. He remembered the former director of the orphanage who had said that the lady had asked him to take good care of the precious child. The Duke wondered if his words were the cause of the discomfort. He was furious, as he knew perfectly well that it was his mistake. He sighed heavily and said angrily that they should not have told the young lady about her mother. The Duchess slowly approached her husband and said that it was not so. The Duke looked hard at his wife and said that as soon as he thought it would be best for the young lady to leave them, he immediately told her about her mother. He was furious because as a result, their baby was hurt again. A moment later, he froze in place, and looking at everyone present, asked if the woman and children were not in the same place now. They looked at the Duke in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the Duke looked at the servant with fury and told him to order the guards to catch those two at once. He shouted that they had to protect the children no matter what. The maid ran in a hurry. She was in shock and said that this simply could not be. She was furious because she knew she had to be treated like that. The knight looked at the maid and said that only Miss Louise had been invited to the table. She was furious, and at the same time, she understood that all that was needed now was to persuade the girl to go with them. She understood perfectly well that so far everything was going as she had discussed with her sister. The girl was shocked and furious. She did not understand how the impudent orphan dared to look at her with such a contemptuous gaze. She looked at her sister and asked if she had really been kicked out without a letter of recommendation. She looked at her sister with fury and shouted at her that she should have known how important the letter of recommendation was to them. The girl shouted because she was furious. She knew that everything happened because of that girl, and she did nothing wrong. She was furious, and she knew she had done nothing wrong. She knew she shouldn't be treated like that. She approached her sister and furiously asked her to help her. The maid knew that even the Duke himself could not find reasons for suspicion because she found a person not only similar in appearance, but also suitable in age and background. She looked at Louise intently and said that if their business went well, she would also get a good share. The maid understood perfectly well that the girl was very well protected and looked after, so they would definitely take care of the money for her. She knew that once they got the money, they could lock that girl up again in an unknown orphanage. She knew perfectly well that they needed to confirm the plan with Louise when she returned. A moment later, the maid froze in place as she saw the knights. She was shocked because she heard them shouting about the Duke's order and wanted to search the entire estate. The knight looked closely at his subordinates and told them to bring anything that looked very suspicious. Sir Cosvin looked closely at the bunks and the king and asked where the two had gone. The knight said that a woman named Louise had recently been in the dining room. The scissor looked at the knight and told him to go to the dining room and bring her. He told the other knights to search all the rooms. The maid stood quietly behind the door and trembled with fear. She was in shock and could not believe that they were discovered. The maid understood perfectly well that no matter how much they bathed under her, they would not find anything. She was alarmed because she did not understand what had happened at all. Some time later, Louise approached the maid and asked what she was doing. Louise looked at the maid with a smile and said that the aristocratic family is, oh, very amazing. She looked at the maid with a smile and said that she could not even imagine how unique all the dishes are. Louise looked at the maid in surprise and asked why there was so much noise in their room. She did not understand what had happened. The maid grabbed Louise by the hand and said that they needed to run immediately. She said that she would definitely tell her everything on the way. The servant looked closely at the Duke and said that he thought they had sensed something was wrong and had already fled. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at those present, said that most likely they still had not left the residence. The Duke looked at them closely and said that there was a possibility that they could be disguised as servants. He said that they should be vigilant. The servant thought for a moment and said that he understood everything. He was puzzled and said that it seemed that they were not the only ones involved in this deception. After all, commoners cannot know the situation in the Duke's family so well. The Duke looked at everyone present with fury and said that there must be an accomplice with them who was related to his family. He looked at those present with fury and told them to immediately find out who was behind all this. Louise, trembling with fear, looked at the maid and asked what they should do now. She was very worried because she was afraid that they would be caught. The maid looked at Louise intently and said that at the very least they would not be able to leave this mansion on their own 2 feet. Louise was shocked. She said that they had not agreed on this. She said that it was said that she would just be able to take a lot of money. The maid quickly covered her mouth with her hand. She looked at Louise intently and told her to speak more quietly. She said that Louise was to receive a lot of money if she succeeded. The maid asked the lady if she didn't see what was happening around her now. The maid, in turn, understood perfectly well that in this situation they could do nothing. She, of course, felt sorry for the money spent, but she knew that now she needed to hide quickly. The maid suddenly heard En Wu, wondering that she had to carry a lot of snacks for one young master. But another maid said that it was all because the master would not be eating alone. She said that he would eat with the little lady in the garden behind the mansion. The maid and Louise became wary as they now understood where they should go. The young gentleman sat down on the ground with a smile and said that it was very funny. He looked at his sister closely and said with a smile that she needed to develop her endurance since he had caught her too quickly. The young lady in turn agreed with him. The young master looked at his sister intently, but did not answer. A moment later, he asked her anxiously if he could ask her a question. She looked at him in surprise. He asked if she was really going to leave their estate. The young lady looked at the young master intently. She did not expect such a question at all. He looked at her intently and said that he really, really liked her. With tears in his eyes, he said that unfortunately, he could not stop her from leaving with her mother. Wiping away his tears, he said that if she was torn away from her mother, she would be very sad. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her and said that she could come to them whenever she wanted, because he would be waiting for her. The young lady in turn looked at him intently, with tears in her eyes, as she was touched by his words. A moment later, they were both crying and hugging each other. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should not forget him. He said that she should promise him this. She cried and said that she would never forget about him. A moment later, Louise came up to them and looked at the young lady with a smile. The children froze in surprise, looking at them. Louise looked at the young lady intently and said that she was there because she wanted to talk to her alone. She smiled, looking at the lady, and said that they had never been alone with her before. Andrea, in turn, looked intently at the lady. Louise looked at the lady closely and smirked as she told her to come over to her. Rosny stood frozen in place. She was anxious. She looked intently at Louise, but did not dare to approach her. Andrea looked at the young lady with excitement and called her. But wisely, not long after, he froze in place as he had just said that he was ready to let her go. He did not know what to do anymore. A moment later, He looked at his sister and said that she must not forget the promise she had made to him. Louise looked at the young lady intently and said that if she liked it here, she would not force her to come with her. The young lady looked at Louise in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Louise looked at the young lady intently and said that she had only come for her now, and therefore knew that she had no right to be her mother. Louise looked at the lady intently and asked if she couldn't give her mother another chance. Roro in turn froze in place, not knowing what to answer. Louise P. looked at the girl and asked if she could confide in her mother one last time. She said in a trembling voice that as her mother, she promised to do everything possible for her. The young lady with tears in her eyes looked at Louise intently and asked in a trembling voice if she really was her mother. Louise smiled and with tears in her eyes said that she was of course her mother. Roro with tears in her eyes and trembling approached her mother and called her. She reached out to her to hug her, but unexpectedly for the young lady a wave of unpleasant feelings washed over her and she cut herself off from her mother. The young lady was shocked as she could clearly feel the pain. She was puzzled as the touch was very prickly. Louise looked at the young lady closely and called her. She looked at the girl in surprise and asked what was wrong with her. Louise did not expect the girl to be so wary of looking at her mother. Louise reached out to the young lady, but she froze in shock and made a long sound. The maid looked at Louise intently and told her to just grab the girl as their goal was very close. Louise in turn rushed furiously towards the girl. Since she was so close to her, she shouted at Rosny to stand still, and still Roro Z froze in shock. She closed her eyes in fear, but a moment later she opened her eyes as she realized that nothing had happened and no one had grabbed her. Leon in turn blocked the young laziness. He looked at Louise in surprise and asked what happened. He did not understand how she dared to do this to a young lady. He looked at Louise with fury and asked how she dared to touch my lady. Louise looked at her hand in surprise as she was in shock. She didn't expect the boy to hurt her. The young gentleman quickly ran up to his sister and asked if she was okay, as he was very worried. A moment later, knights ran up to them. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Roro was surprised and did not expect to see the Duke. The Duke looked sideways at the knights and told them to lock the women up and investigate everything thoroughly. He said that they should not miss anything. The Duke looked closely at the boys and said that they both did well for protecting the young lady. After hearing his father's words, the young master's expression became sad as he realized that he had failed to protect the young lady. He looked at her intently. Leona said that he was her older brother, but unfortunately, he couldn't protect her properly. He looked at her intently. Leona said that this time he lost to him, but next time he would protect his sister. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and said that it was very good that this time she was okay. He said that he would definitely protect her with his own strength. The young lady in turn was trembling with fear. She looked intently at the Duke and called him. The Duke stroked the young lady's head and said that she had just had a bad dream. He said tenderly that if she closed her eyes, she would fall asleep again. Louise looked at the Duke intently and in a trembling voice said that she had committed a great stupidity. Louise shouted angrily at the maid and said that it was all because of her, because if it weren't for the maid, she wouldn't have gotten into this situation. The maid looked at Louise angrily and asked which of them was blinded by the amount of money they received. The Duke angrily told them to sit still as everything would go back to how it was before. The young lady in turn burst into bitter tears as she was very hurt by such betrayal. The Duke looked closely at the doctor and asked how their baby was feeling. The doctor sighed heavily and said that he had given her medicine, but P would need more time for the fever to go down. The Duchess looked at the young lady sadly as she was very small. She was puzzled as she understood that the young lady had had a very hard time. Roro opened her eyes and saw the Duchess in front of her. The Duchess was shocked and did not expect the young lady to wake up. She looked at her intently and asked how she was feeling. The Duchess looked sadly at the young lady and said that she seemed to be very worried about the situation. Roro looked at the Duke and Duchess closely. She thought that her own mother would have been worried about her when she fell ill, just like the Duke and Duchess were doing now. She thought that most likely her brother was also worried about her. She slowly opened her eyes and saw a silhouette in front of her. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently and with a start said that he seemed to have woken her up. He looked at her with a smile and said that since she was awake, she could eat some porridge and later fall asleep again. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at the young man in surprise. She did not expect to see her brother Julisi. Roro sat on the bed, with lightning speed. She was in shock. She didn't expect to see her brother. She looked at him in surprise, and asked what he was doing here. The young gentleman looked at her intently, and said with a smile that he might feel dizzy if he stood up suddenly. She looked at him intently. She couldn't believe that he was next to her now, Julius. Looking at the lady, said that the doctor said that the medicine would be better absorbed with food. He said that for this reason, the maid left the porridge and ordered her to be fed when she woke up. She looked intently at the young master and told him to convey her gratitude to the maid. Julius slowly brought the spoon to the young lady's mouth. She froze in shock. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should say, The young lady froze in embarrassment and asked what he was talking about. She said sheepishly that she could eat on her own. He shouldn't feed her at all. He looked at her intently and said that it would be difficult for her to eat on her own. Julius, looking at the young lady, she said that she had slept for 2 days before his arrival. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect this. He sighed heavily and said that his mother had told him everything that had happened here. Julius said that as soon as he heard the news, he came straight away. He said that he didn't want to wake her up because he knew that she needed to continue to rest. He stroked her head tenderly and said with a smile that he was worried about her, and now he was glad that she was okay. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled looking at her and said that she was still weak, so he would feed her himself. Rosny was very confused. She said that she was fine. Roro looked at him intently and said that she didn't even have a fever, and she also didn't feel dizzy anymore. She said that she was completely healthy. He looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and agreed with her. He asked if she could eat everything. She smiled and said that she would eat everything. She ate the warm and soft porridge, but she was still sad that the woman was not her real mother. She knew that even if this was the case for her, there were people now who loved her and surrounded her with care. She looked intently at the young gentleman and thanked him. For several days, the young lady felt very cheerful as she only ate and rested. The doctor looked at the young lady in surprise and said that usually it takes a long time for the temperature to drop, but in her case it happened much sooner. She was very glad that everything went very quickly for her, as she did not want to bother anyone else. The young gentleman looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he had found her. She was surprised as she was caught quickly, could handle this game better than she could. The young gentleman was taken aback and said that he had completely forgotten about him. Leon, in turn, hid under the sofa. A moment later, he crawled out from under the sofa and said that he had been there. The young master looked at his friend in surprise and asked how long he had been there. He looked at those present and said that, as the knight of the young and the lady, he hid not far from her. She looked at him in surprise and said that she had no idea that he was there. Andrea looked at his friend and asked if he was convinced that he could not find him. Leon looked at him and said that of course he was not offended. Andrea looked at his friend and said that this time he would introduce, so as not to convince Leon, said that he was not offended. Julius P. approached them and said with a smile that in that case he would drive. He looked at those present and said with a smile that he would like to play with them. Andrea asked his brother in surprise if he had just finished fencing training. Julius looked at his brother intently and said that everything was fine. That's exactly how he had sparring today. The lady in turn watched the brothers closely, who were engaged in a casual conversation. Leon noticed that the young lady was looking intently at the older gentleman. The young gentleman looked at them with a smile and said that their game looked fun. Looking at them, he asked if he really needed to count to 10. Andrea looked intently at his brother and said that he should count slowly. The young gentleman grabbed his friend's hand with lightning speed and told him to quickly tell him where to hide. The young lady, in turn, was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. She froze in place because she didn't know where to hide. A moment later, she saw the sofa of the Waters, which was her friend. She knew that it was a very good and safe place and decided to hide there. She understood perfectly well that if her friend had crawled under the sofa, then she could too. But a moment later, she froze in place as she realized that she was stuck. The young lady in turn was in shock as she could not let go. Sometime later, the young masterpiece stopped counting. He froze in surprise. But when he saw his little sister, who was stuck under the sofa, he looked at her in bewilderment and called out. The young lady in turn froze in embarrassment. She was very ashamed that he saw her in such a state. A moment later, the young gentleman came up to her and helped her. The young lady sat down on the ground. She was in shock and wanted to fall through the ground. The young gentleman looked at her intently, and unable to contain himself, burst out laughing. She looked at him in surprise, with tears in her eyes, as she was very ashamed. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise, as he laughed without stopping. With tears in her eyes, she rushed to him and told him that he should not laugh. He smiled and did not ask for forgiveness, since he did not do it on purpose. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was very cute, and so he couldn't help but laugh. She was shocked because she had always heard from other people that she was very cute. She looked at him intently and called out. The master looked at her in surprise. Roro looked at her brother and said that she liked him very much. Julius, looking out the window, said that the younger sisters were very cute creatures. His friends looked at him in surprise and confusion, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. They looked at him in surprise and asked what he was saying. They didn't understand how he could call them cute. His friend was marked, but looked at him and said that he was even a monster cuter than his sisters. His friends said that they have sisters, and in front of their parents, they pretend to be kind and nice. But as soon as they look at them, they start to mock them incessantly. The young man looked at his friend and said that he should not give in to illusions. The young master was puzzled, because he knew that the young lady was indeed very cute. He looked closely at the young lady, and with a smile said that he liked her too. Andrea walked up to his brother and looked at them in surprise. He was in shock. He didn't understand why Lady Juno was screaming. Julius P. looked at the young guys and said that he found them. Andrea was surprised. Andrea looked at his brother and said that it was unfair, because they had simply fallen into his trap. Roro realized that her brother simply viewed her as a child. She was in shock and didn't understand why it hurt her so much. Leon looked at the young lady intently and said that if she sat on the floor, she would freeze. She looked closely at her friend and thanked him for his concern. The young lady looked at him closely and said that he would have something on his face. He sighed heavily and said that he was fine. The young lion and her friend stared at the brothers, who were having a casual conversation. Leon looked closely at the young lady, as he now realized that she liked the older gentleman. He sighed heavily as he realized that she was the one he had never even dared to dream about. However, he wanted to watch her smile up close. He understood that this would be enough for him. Julius looked at everyone present and said that he would have to return to the academy, but this time he would not be there longer. Looking at the young lady, he said that his next visit would be probably next year. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He stroked her head tenderly and said that he was teaching her to spend as much time with them as possible while he was at the estate. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young master with embarrassment, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at the young master intently, as every time he said something like that, her heart began to beat faster. She looked intently at the young master, as all her thoughts flew away after his words. The Duchess looked intently at the young lady and called her. She asked her excitedly how Rosny was feeling. She said that if she was in any pain, she should tell her right away. Roro S. said that she was fine. The Duchess looked at her in surprise, asked if she didn't like the dessert. The young lady finally came to her senses. She realized that she was thinking about her brother, who had left a couple of days ago. She looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she was fine, and the desserts were very tasty. A moment later, the Duchess called her Lady. The Duchess apologized to the baby for not being able to take proper care of her. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that those who had hurt her would no longer appear before her. He looked at her intently and said that he was very sorry that he could not do more for her. Roro looked at them intently and said that it was not like that, because they cared about her so much, and she knew it. She said that she knew that they deserved to be treated like that. She looked at them closely and said that for that reason, she was really okay. The Duke looked at her intently and said that they very much wished and hoped that she would never have to face anything like that again. She looked at him intently and said that she would be more careful in the future. He looked at her intently and said that they would like to become her real family. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked what he was talking about. It was given to us and said that they would like to become her real family, to become a support for her, whom she could trust. At any time, the Duchess looked at her with a smile and asked if she would become their daughter. Roro froze in place as she unexpectedly saw something like this. The young lady in turn froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. Herzen looked at her intently and said that she should make a decision with a light heart. He smiled and said that they just wanted to protect her so that no one would dare to treat her badly. She wondered if she would ever meet such nice people. She understood that if she was close to them, she would be just as happy as she was now. She looked closely at her wife and timidly said that, unfortunately, she would not be able to become their daughter. The couple looked at each other as they had hoped for a different answer. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and asked if he could know why she had given such an answer. She sighed heavily and said that it was all because she wanted to wait for her mother a little longer. She was puzzled because unfortunately she did not remember her face. She did not know why her mother left her in the orphanage. She looked at them intently and said that if she met her, she would like to ask about everything. She looked at them intently and said that nevertheless, she was very grateful to them. She smiled and said that they showed her what happiness was. Roro said that they became a real family to her. The Duke looked closely at the young league and with a smile said that everything was fine and they were not forcing her in any way. The Duchess looked at her with a smile and said that she had nothing to apologize for. The Duchess hugged the young lady tenderly with a smile on her face. The Duchess told the young league that if her heart ever opened up, she should make sure to let them know. Rosny froze in the Duchess's arms. She felt very warm and cozy. The Duchess smiled at the young lady and asked her if she liked her new hairstyle. Roro said with a smile that she really liked it, since she had never seen anything like it. Andrea was shocked. He looked at his sister intently and asked why she liked it so much. He shouted at his mother that she had done the young lady's hair wrong. He looked closely at his sister and said that she now looked as if she had horns growing out of her head. The young lady said that she liked it. The Duchess looked at her son in surprise and said that it was too much his own thing. A moment later, the Duchess had redone the young lady's hair and asked if it was better that way. The young gentleman, with the speed of lightning, took her to her lady from his mother and told her that she must stop. The young lady in turn said that she really liked this hairstyle. He looked at his sister intently, did not say that he thought he knew everything about her tastes, but it turned out that this was not so. The young lady in turn laughed. The Duchess looked intently at the children. She looked at them intently and asked how about having a tea party. Roro looked at the Duchess in surprise. The Duchess smiled and said that she would like to have a tea party as she had no friends her own age. The young lady was worried. She wondered what if her friends would also hate her like Lydia. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she could invite anyone she wanted to tea. She smiled and said that they could out-extinguish the princess. She thought for a moment as she knew that the princess had treated her very well. Roro wondered if she would ever meet another friend as good as the princess again. She looked at the duchesses and said that she would like to go to tea. The Duchess and the young gentleman, in turn, were very glad that she agreed. The Duchess looked at her son closely and said that he should know that boys cannot go to tea. The gentleman was shocked as he did not expect such a thing. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said that there was much to prepare before tea. Roro said with a radiant smile that she would definitely try her best. The Duke looked at his wife intently and asked if it was tea day today. The Duchess smiled and said that it was. The Duchess said with a smile that the young lady had helped a lot with the preparations. Andrea sighed heavily and said that he also wanted to go with them. The Duke said with a smile that he very much hoped that the event would be a positive experience for the little girl. The maid looked at the Duchess and said that the young lady had already finished preparing. The Duchess was glad that the young lady was already ready. A moment later, a young lady entered the room and greeted everyone present. Everyone present was amazed by the beauty of the young lady. The young gentleman, in turn, circled around his sister and said with a smile that she had become even sweeter. The Duchess said with a smile that since all the preparations were already completed, they could go. The young lady, in turn, was very nervous, but at the same time she was excited. She wondered if she would be able to meet new friends for tea.